I just, as we're now recording, so there's that note up there that just to let everybody know that we are recording the meeting to be used for afterwards. There's food and beverages in the back for everybody to use, so just make your way back there whenever you need a refreshment or some food to keep us going. So, and then the Wi-Fi password is a little different. It was supposed to be HFIP 22, but that's what we got. So FIBP 22, for those who don't have it, it's the Hilton Honors meeting Wi-Fi. Yeah, and I think that's everything. Hand it over to Aaron then if you're ready to go. So, okay.
Thanks, Paul. First things first, welcome. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. As Paul said, it's great to see people in something other than a little 3x3 box. For those of you in the box, my apologies. And for your refreshments, feel free to go to your kitchen whenever you need to. Just give me a second here while we're getting slides up. I don't really have a lot of programmatic stuff to give right now because this upcoming budget or this year's budget is uncertain. But I've been asked to be the guinea pig for at least some of the slides for the HAFS V1 implementation rollout slideshow that management and others will be doing as we approach next hurricane season. So that's what I'm going to go through here. Jenny, can you go to the slide? Oh, is the row here? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. So as most of you that are oriented with HAFS and HFIP already know, here's our transition to operations plan. Real-time experiments technically just ended. I'm not sure if we're actually doing anything for the system that's out there right now. We are, okay, so it's not ended yet. So ignore the word complete. And I'm sorry, Frank? November 30th, okay. And so evaluation development, of course, of this year's season will be ongoing, and the real-time experiments are still ongoing. And the we are here is not quite perfect yet, but we're in that general phase of evaluation and further development and fine-tuning the system and going through the 3-year retrospectives. I know I have seen some results from those, but I think they're preliminary at this point. And then we'll move into our code optimization and the handoff to NCO before we go into implementation for 2023 hurricane season. Hey, the button works. All right. It's the basic workflow. It's effectively the same slide as before, but with a little more detail on those groups for our current and estimated timelines. As you all know, there's a lot that has to go into this before we transition it to operation that certainly we never could have gotten to without the awesome work that's come from everyone in this room, on the other end of the virtual link, and lots of other places as well. And it's a lot of this is thanks to the Weather Research Forecasting Innovation Act 2017 that was signed on April 18th. Don't really need to do much more into that. And I just lost video. Okay, thank you. Maybe. Bear with us out there in computer land. We're having some technical difficulties with an HDMI cable. And all right. So the phase transition here from legacy systems to UFS. We have our products, our science, and our coordination that's moving along, transitioning into operations to get all of UFS applications into operation and moving along to a more unified process here. And HAFS components, not really going to bother reading all these bullets. I don't think that's really meaningful for any of us. So feel free to read yourselves. These slides are also going to be available. And apparently I don't have access to view the video. Yeah, but it's a video that everyone's seen. It's on the HFIP.org webpage. It's the multi-basin animation of the moving nests and lots of multiple storms. So if you want to see it, go to HFIP.org and it will be on the webpage there. Now I will move into a little bit more programmatic oriented stuff. So I'm saying that right now we're kind of at a precipice of having to choose our own adventure here. Do we want to be on a road to ruin, like the Ramones would say, or take that path of leaps and bounds and failures and successes and get to where we need to be? I think we already know what we're doing. We've obviously had setbacks and things. We see some issues here and there, but we also have a lot of successes that we don't want to sit back on. We want to keep pressing. And my thoughts on that are, we need to navigate all those budget issues. It's never easy. Case in point, the CR right now, that we don't know if we extended beyond mid-December or not. We don't know what tomorrow may bring, especially considering it's a midterm election. But all we can do is just keep moving along with it. Like I say up here on the slides, my main goal here is to support you guys through listening to you and learning and providing leadership through that. I don't have a background in hurricanes. My background is predominantly in surface observations and test and evaluation of hardware and software. So I've got a lot to learn, but I've already, over the last 7 months, I've learned a ton from a lot of extremely intelligent hurricane folks. And I look forward to learning a lot more and using that to help push and guide things along to get this program to where it needs to be and wants to be. Yeah, obviously we're already poised to evolve the TC models beyond where we're at, through the, not just with track and intensity, but also bringing social, behavioral, and economic science into probabilistic forecasting communications. I think that's really the key strong point here of what HFIP needs to be going forward, so we can get out there and do our true mission of saving more lives and protecting more property. And hopefully this week it doesn't get shortened more than it already is, and we actually can talk about our successes and our future and guide us along that fun little adventure that windy, bumpy road leads to. So a little bit on the HFIP budget. Last year's budget was 454, I think it was actually, million, including the direct allotments to EMC and NHC. This year's budget right now is estimated. There's quite a bit of TBD beyond the CRs. We just don't know. Right now, our estimates are a little bit more than last year, but we don't have any set numbers, obviously. So I'm not expecting miracles on getting back to funding that it was 10 years ago, but we're going to work to maintain at least what we had and hopefully gain. And I think Ian helped us with that, because we can look at some of the preliminary results we've already seen and show that HAFS is doing a very good job with a lot of it, but still leaves us room to work and show that further improvements over the next several years have to happen. Real-time experiments this year has taught us a couple things. We have issues with JET, which we already knew. There's a lot of talks with Frank and Viglio and others on getting other allocations, getting new equipment, getting things set up differently that are, again, money and time dependent. So we will get there with your help and with everybody else's help. Some successes out of that, we have successfully modeled the dual eyewall aspects of Ian, did a very good job with that. And the track HAFS A especially did not have as much of a left bias as a lot of the other models, which is quite astounding considering everybody else's basic consensus was much further to the west. Intensity, we've seen periods where it's improved and also periods in the timeline where it is reduced performance compared to HWRF's current capabilities, but to be expected as we learn and grow this model. And we're running on non-optimized completed code at this point. And like I said, all that's being worked on before we get to the code handoff. 2023 basic priorities here are getting HAFS V1 into operations, retirement, of course, of H4 from HMON, and then further develop HAFS, work towards version 2 and beyond. And we want to configure and test multiple HAFS pre-V2 configurations in 2023's real-time experiments so that we can move us further and, of course, develop our ensembles, and which would help us in getting towards better probabilistic guidance and risk communication, hazard communication. And any questions? I apologize for moving back and forth away from the mic. I have a tendency to walk when I talk, and it's a stationary mic at this point, but I didn't know if I could actually pull it out and walk around without breaking everything. Sure, Frank, what's your question?
What do we know about the supplemental potentials? You mentioned Ian as possibly.
We know that there was an unnamed supplemental that we were asked to provide permission, information on and wants on, that actually the ask came out before Ian was ever a thought. So don't know exactly where that's going, but hopefully it leads to some positives. HFIP and HAFS were definitely mentioned within that for needing more funding. We also know that the IRA has a lot of funding for HPC, and there's other aspects that we're hoping we can leverage specific to HAFS development and ensembles and so forth.
Well,
And
yeah.
Ian specific, I personally have not heard of a direct supplemental, but the anticipation is because of the level of damage and media coverage and so forth, that there will be one.
The hurricane program is traditionally run by supplementals.
Yes. Oh, that's very true. Yes,
And I think
absolutely.
we get more support from supplemental. I mean, we wouldn't have HAFS without the supplementals
No.
in 18 and 19. So, just for those who are, thinking about funding in the future, that's how we're working pretty much. It's going to be supplemental funding focused on issues that have moved us forward so far. And I think hopefully Kevin and Frank and Dorothy can give us a little
Yes.
more insight.
You stole my words when for announcing the next couple of speakers. You're exactly right. Like I said on the budget slide, that we live on peaks and valleys. Those supplementals are our peaks. Our regular base funding that we really don't have is our valleys. And luckily, there's been lots of supplementals. It's a double-edged sword. If we, living off supplementals is extremely hard to plan for, which is why a lot of times funding memos don't come out until quite late, because we don't have a known value of, or a quantity of dollars. Thank you, Frank. Any other questions online or in the room? I do want to again thank you all for being here. I don't think our meeting will be like the one that was going on when I arrived yesterday. They had several hundred people here that were cheering and clapping after speakers spoke. I don't expect any of that to happen for me at least, but maybe for some of you others. And so our next couple of speakers, our next will be Kevin Garrett. He is the acting OSTI modeling director. I'm going to leave him to talk a little bit more about successes and future plans and so forth. He'll be followed by Dorothy Koch, director of OER WPO, Weather Program Office. And then I believe we have Frank Indiviglio, the deputy director of high power computing, will do a brief opening remark. I'm not sure if Frank is on or not. Oh, I do see his name. I know Kevin's here, so I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there in person.
I know Kevin has slides.
With that, yeah, I do have slides. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, Kevin, hang on a second. We got to tweak the volume. And are you putting your slides up yourself, or did you put them in the folder for Jenny to pull up?
They're in the folder. I could probably share them if that's easier.
All right, she's looking for me. Oh, we got them. All right, can you guys, Kevin, just do another mic test real quick?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good at this end. Thank you.
All right, so you're all set. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, can you see your slides at your end? Okay.
Yes, I can. Looks good.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Good morning. Yeah, so I wanted to start with really just a brief overview of the modeling program at the Weather Service Office of Science and Technology Integration, and what we're doing to support HFIP. Again, for those that don't know me, my name is Kevin Garrett, and I'm the acting director of the modeling program there. You can go to the next slide. So STI is a program office that is really focused on supporting the transition of Earth system model advancements into weather service operations, again, with the goal of improved weather forecasts. We certainly recognize that, the modeling aspect is really just one critical tool across that weather forecast process. And, we're trying to understand really how, where we focus our priorities and our resources to get these advancements across the finish line into operations where our users and stakeholders can take advantage of that information to communicate that forecast information to their stakeholders and the public at large, for taking in lots of respects as it relates to HFIP, life-saving actions. So part of that too is also making sure that we're really building and fostering critical partnerships across the weather and the modeling enterprise specifically, again, to sort of identify and then resource the development and transition priorities and manage that process in terms of their integration into our operational environment. So again, we have really 5, I would say, major programs within STI modeling, which are listed here below, with HFIP, of course, being one of those. Next slide, please. So we found that really one way to effectively manage the transition of research developments into operations is through what was initiated back in 2020 as the UFS R2O project. This was actually something initiated by Dorothy Koch, who is speaking next now with WPO. But really, it's been a successful way to sort of energize and focus the transition of really critical advancements into weather service operations. And part of that is really, as you see with the project structure on the right here, is to sort of bring together the research and the operational communities into what we call these application teams, so they can work together to focus on the work that needs to be done to integrate new advancements into an operational system and sort of bring it over the finish line. So again, we started in 2020. We're in year 3 now, so I'll talk a little bit about the HFIP year 3 activities. But you can see here the other applications in terms of supporting medium range and S2S prediction, short range and convective allowing systems, and then the hurricane integrated application team. Below those 3 main application teams, we have what we call the cross-cutting teams. And those are really teams that are organized to focus the development of the component models and the configurations of those component models that are applicable to all the higher level applications within the UFS framework. So we can go to the next slide. So again, for year 3 activities, I think Aaron, talked about a lot of this in terms of a lot of the work that's being done to support the HAFS V1 transition coming up in quarter 3 of our fiscal year in June of 2023. But again, these are activities that, as I said, are sort of done under this umbrella where we can bring our partners together from EMC, from the OAR labs, UCAR, and academia to work on a lot of these model advancements and get them into the operational system. So there's been a lot of work on HAFS V1 in terms of improving the physics, getting ready for the real-time experiments in the IOC, and then coming down the road, a lot of remaining tuning and optimization work that should be done, performing retrospectives, doing the evaluation, and then eventually working towards that code freeze so that we can prepare for transition operations. There's also other development, again, looking beyond year 3 in terms of what needs to be done for later versions of HAFS as well that are supported in year 3. Next slide. We do have some other programs within STI modeling that support HFIP as well as the other modeling programs. Some of the support is done through federal funding opportunities. So we've had grants usually on a 2-year cycle. Just listing here the FY20 and FY22 grants that are related to hurricane forecasting. We also support the Development Testbed Center, DTC, who previously has really been critical in supporting the community research and transition work for HWRF. And so we're working with DTC and EPIC on that transition to the HAFS hurricane application release. And of course, the critical testing and evaluation work that's done on all the modeling advancements in partnership with the greater community. Next slide, please. So I'll end on this slide. And again, looking back through this UFS R2O lens and just kind of trying to identify the things moving beyond year 3 of the UFS R2O project, what we're calling a phase 2. This is just kind of something to illustrate that pipeline where we work to identify the HFIP priorities, a lot of which are documented in the strategic plan. But that a lot of those priorities have perhaps shifted over the last couple of years. And after identifying those priorities, working with our research partners and OAR and WPO specifically, as well as having an awareness of all the other activities that are ongoing that support hurricane forecasting through the hurricane supplementals and other injections of funding. And then working to scope out really, what those priorities are and resourcing those to produce sort of a detailed project plans to advance our hurricane modeling and forecasting capabilities, through this development ecosystem. And then again, working across through our partnerships with the research community and transitioning those developments into operations. And again, just noting that, it's not in the T to O phase, it's not just about transitioning to an operational environment, but also making available very relevant hurricane application to the UFS community to continue to work on improving those capabilities. So with that, I'll stop. And I just wanted to say that the agenda that's been put together is really impressive. It's comprehensive in terms of not just talking about all the modeling advancements and new capabilities and the things that are being addressed, but also, the really interesting work that's been done to evaluate the current capabilities, looking through different diagnostics, other impact studies through data assimilation, and even bringing in the SBES aspects as well. So I'm really excited to see, or will be really excited to see, the different outcomes and how those shape future priorities for HFIP and hurricane modeling. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it. Are there any questions for Kevin? Are there any questions?
If Frank has the same question for me, I don't actually have any answers. So maybe Dorothy has some better insight into upcoming supplementals, but I don't really have any new news on that front.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. Frank is nodding his head. Thanks. Jenny, are there any questions from online at all? All right, we'll move on to our next speaker. That's Dorothy Koch, the Director of OAR Weather Program Office and former OSTI Modeling Director. And Dorothy, I don't think has any slides.
I do not. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the HFIP meeting from me as well. I'm very excited for those of you that get to meet in person. I guess it was 2 years ago that I came when I was STI modeling director, and lots of deck chairs have moved around since then. So now over in OAR Weather Program Office, and we now have Kevin Garrett and Aaron Poyer in place in STI, and I feel very positive about how things are evolving at headquarters. I think it's going to be good for hurricane research. So so although I'm not there in person, I wish I were. There's a lot of staff from WPO. So I have three points, really, no slides, but 3 points. One is to talk about WPO support for hurricane research. The second is to talk about support more generally for hurricane research and modeling and operations. And then a lot of the, little bit of a different angle, but similar to what Kevin was talking about in terms of project organization. So, I think part of the reason you see so many folks from WPO there from headquarters is that, HFIP is a model project and program for how we, do project development, cross line offices with the community, and how we organize, questions that are well poised to, frame a program. And so it's a real poster child for that. It's a good one for us to pay a lot of attention to and to learn from and to use in our other projects, including UFS R2O. It's also a poster child for integration of social sciences into the physical modeling and product development. So hence you have a lot of folks there who are interested from WPO. So just to say a little bit more about that, we have from our disaster supplemental team, I hope I get everybody here. Ben Woods is there, who's been disaster supplemental kind of lead, one of the leads for that program. And yes, indeed, we are depending on supplementals for support for hurricane modeling and forecasting. I don't necessarily see that changing. I don't know anything about, whether there's another supplemental for Ian, but, like others have said, I wouldn't be surprised. And I think we have a lot of the pieces in place so that we can respond very quickly. I know the teams have been working across line offices to put together a nice set of projects that would really, continue to push forward in hurricane forecasting. So, certainly there's FY18 and FY22 now support for hurricanes. And yeah, as I said, maybe more in 23 to come. In terms of social science, I already mentioned that this is a real poster child for how we integrate social sciences. I think because we had that FY18 support and Weather Service and OAR teamed up and have been, really leading the way in that integration of social science into forecasting. Really excited to learn more about, their last push during Ian, getting out in the field and surveying how people were hearing the forecast or not, and how they responded, and following up on that. So again, this is really going to help continue to get that kind of support for hurricane research, but also for other fields as well. We also have, so Gina S. goes there for social science, maybe I mentioned. We have from our testbed program, Jordan Dale, I think is there with you as well. And I think he'll be speaking later on in the meeting. We've got several new projects awarded from the testbed program for the newly named HOT, H-O-T, Hurricane Ocean Testbed. So I'm very excited about those projects, and I imagine you'll hear more about those as well. Maui Huang from EPIC is also there. And EPIC will be eventually providing the support for the release of the HAFS system. And so encourage you to talk with her and work with her on, what's the best timing for that. I don't think EPIC has the resources necessarily this year, even if you wanted to have it released this year. But I think it's important to get the timing right, because we're going to need engagement from, the HFIP team before we do that release, and as we do that release, and sustain to some extent. I mean, the EPIC contract doesn't have the skill set to do all that support on their own. So it'll take a little bit of work. And I remember last time, was it 2 years ago, we were nowhere near ready to release HAFS. Maybe you're closer now, but talk with Maui about that. The other thing the EPIC will be doing is starting with the short range weather system and kind of working out some of the kinks in the workflow in terms of putting the model into the cloud and, training and testing and evaluation and getting innovations into our modeling system. So hopefully that will help clear the way for the HAFS system. And then I don't think we have anyone there specifically from the OBS program, although Ben is in that team, but certainly the observations program within WP also supports work like sail drones and other activities for hurricane forecasting. We're also involved in the Weather Program Office in the coordination of the airborne phased array radar research that NCAR is conducting, developing that system. So that's another really important area where WPO has been, Mark Vincent in particular, has been extremely engaged. In terms of resourcing, part of the problem with HFIP, we've talked about this before, is that it's almost too successful. And so it's hard to go back to Congress and say we need more funding. We do need more funding. And so I think it's going to be increasingly important for the hurricane community to be working with other parts of the Unified Forecast System community and to get support within that context. So, think about severe weather and other regional systems like fire models that need, similar to what Kevin had, I think on his 6th slide, moving nests, an ability to work with physics across scales, and an ability and to adjust your physics. Obviously the physics that you need for a fire is not going to be quite tuned the same way as you would for a hurricane, but you still have some of the same challenges working across scales and getting scale aware treatments. Data assimilation approaches that need to be, tailored across scales and coupled. Improvements to computational performance, integration of the modeling systems with social science, product development, working with ensembles and probabilistic forecasts. These are all common to all of these different systems, and I think working more in that team approach may be a more effective way to get sustained support for hurricane research. And so I guess my last point is just to talk about the UFS R2O project that Kevin has mentioned already. I think you need to think really carefully about how HFIP should relate to that project. The project has been quite successful, I would say, in spite of having a very rough time with budget over the last year or two. But it's successful. It's a great way to integrate weather service, OAR, and the community into a single system, as was on that slide that Kevin shared. And we have a similar situation, let's say like with fire weather and hurricanes. It's not just modeling, it also has to have, social science and product development. So, it's also the fire weather and hurricanes are both being supported by supplementals, et cetera. So, what's the best way to organize these in the most effective way? And so think really carefully about how HFIP and that your project there should engage with UFS R2O. It's almost like a third dimension almost coming out of that page because you have more than modeling involved. But I do think there's a lot of strategic advantages to pulling it in a little bit tighter in the next round of the UFS R2O project. So that's all I have. I wish you all a really good meeting. I'll try to tune in as much as I can over the next couple of days. Well, thank you. Any questions for me?
Dorothy?
Yes.
Frank has a question.
Yes.
Same question I asked Aaron and Kevin. What do we know about the supplemental? Where do we stand on that? Is there any action coming, or do we know it's just pie in the sky at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know anything more either. I think as they already said, we've submitted budget requests already. And so I think you've already been engaged in that, Frank, as much as any of us, I believe. I guess we'll just wait and see. I think we've got enough information in there on what our needs are that we should be able to move fairly quickly if the opportunity arises. But I guess one other thing that I'd heard is that they weren't going to vote on it till I think after the election. So that's coming up pretty soon. But yeah, that's all I know.
We have another question in the room. Vijay, go ahead.
Hey, Dorothy.
Hey, Vijay.
Great opening, and thanks for all the information. You mentioned about HFIP being integrated into UFS or UFS R2O. Is that with an anticipation that the budget associated with HFIP will become part of UFS, or is that just the way you would like to see how the UFS applications are coordinated better within the UFS R2O or in the larger UFS context?
I mean, I think it's kind of both. I think, from an integration and modeling point of view, to me, it makes sense. I'm interested in what you all think, but, a lot of the challenges really, span the different applications. And so working on them together in one team, at least from a modeling point of view, to me makes sense. In terms of budget, I think this is another question that Kevin and STI WPO need to talk about, is whether we want to kind of manage the supplemental projects as part of UFS R2O, to basically have UFS R2O team also managing those supplemental projects. Again, to me, I think that would be easier. I think it would cut down on the number of meetings and the number of taskers and, help with coordination. And then in terms of future budget, to me, again, the more we're pulled into a single team, the easier it's going to be to go to Congress and say, look, we need support for the unified forecast system and for UFS R2O in particular. And that would, that would improve our forecasting of hurricanes and severe weather and fires and subseasonal to seasonal, et cetera. So hope it answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I have one follow-on question. This HFIP community is almost 13 years old now, like since 2009. And we have built a pretty strong community just focusing on one topic, and we did better, right? By integrating it with other applications, definitely there will be dilution, spreading too thin. So I think maintaining this community as within the UFS umbrella, we are still following that, but having HFIP's own identity is definitely warranted based on what you're seeing year after year after year. So this healthy community should be preserved, and given the importance and the resources to achieve what we wanted to do within this hurricane problem that we are attempting to solve. Supplementals are short-term infusion. We survived so far, but I don't think that is the way to sustain a program like this, including the computing HPC associated with that. So I think even from the program office point of view, this should be given a special consideration and a serious look into how this community can be sustained within its own identity, as also, as you mentioned, integrate with other activities going around, particularly in the modeling area within the UFS.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying, Vijay, and I agree. That's why I think, I think it's going to take some care and thought, like the best way to, leverage what other, modeling and forecasting activities are happening, yet at the same time to maintain a certain amount of coherent and independent approach. And again, like I'm starting to think about fire weather in the same sort of way. There's a whole community that's growing now around fire weather, but is it going to be best for that community to be a whole, let's rebuild an HFIP-like thing or not, when at least at this point, what I'm seeing is a lot of the same people showing up at, yet another set of meetings. And you could say the same thing for severe weather. So, maybe we need to take what we have with something like UFS R2O and, build again, like I was saying, like a third dimension almost that would accommodate, integration of observations and forecast products and social science and those other aspects that we need to do to do our forecasting effectively.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Need creative solutions. Yeah.
There's an online question from John Cortines.
John,
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So my comments follow along the lines of what Vijay said. And Dorothy, I appreciate your response, because I think that's just the reality. The need for us to look across kind of phenomenon that are all focused under other programs that are getting support. But I think one question I have is, just given the complexity of trying to still maintain resources for HFIP, and as Vijay said, a community for HFIP, it's good to see WPO kind of expanding its programs to be inclusive of hurricanes, to kind of offset the reduction in budget that the Weather Service has had specifically for HFIP. But I'm wondering what kind of communication is going on a regular basis that will ensure that hurricanes also remain kind of one of the top phenomenon that we're trying to address in these other programs, whether it's EPIC or R2O or whatever. Is there are there regular meetings, other regular meetings that are going on that ensure that there's hurricane kind of people involved as well?
Not explicitly at headquarters, but I've been actually putting a lot of thought into that, John, in terms of having the need for one or two program points of contact at WPO. Oh, got
Dorothy,
disconnected.
yeah, you're back.
I'm back now. Yeah, I don't know. I just got disconnected. Yeah, I've been thinking about the need to have a couple of people in WPO that are explicitly, points of contact for hurricanes. So that's something that we're talking about internally, and that would give, start to establish more of a headquarters team at both Weather Service and OAR. And maybe we should have someone in NESDIS as well. So.
And if I would also include NOS, because
NOS,
as we increasingly are including the ocean obs,
Yep.
Again, I think it speaks to the need to make sure that we do have headquarters level folks talking about these things, just so that we can ensure that the hurricane topic stays up there as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and I see Cheyenne is online as well. So yeah, the other ocean programs, GOMO and so on, should be part of that team as well. But I'm just talking at this point. We still have yet to take
Dorothy,
that
we have one more question in the room. Oh, she just Cheyenne just said yes to what Dorothy just said. We have one last question in the room, and then we have to move on. Shuja?
Okay.
I think Dorothy and Kevin and Aaron, I'm as a HAFS team lead, the app team lead, we really feel the stress we have during the season without enough resource, especially like the HPC, just make everyone almost burn out. I always tell them, slow down, guys, slow down, because we constantly work 24/7. So this has to, address the next season. This season, we are lucky we don't have so many storms. If we 2020, then we almost dead. That's definitely. And second things I would say, it's almost like it's a paradox. You said HFIP is too successful. So that's why our resource gonna get chipped away or whatever I use. But the things I want to say, we have a CO team. We have been proved. We have proven we can accomplish our task. So give us more ammunition, we will claim bigger victory. That's what I want to say. Thank you, all the support.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Eugene. It occurs to me that that's a story that could be told. And one of the things we've been talking about a bit at headquarters is no one needs to be able to tell its story. And I've been working with WPO to improve our communications. But I would encourage you all in the HFIP team to, tell the story of Ian. You got social scientists there. I'm sure they can help with that as well. But what's it like being, a modeler and trying to get the forecast right, and the kind of the stresses that you're under in the during the hurricane season. I think that kind of information can go a long way in terms of advocating for the need for support.
Thank you, Dorothy. We're going to have to move on to Frank Indiviglio now. Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to keep this short because I know we're cutting into break, and I want to keep you on schedule here. I'm just going to put up the map real quick, if I can do that. Actually, I'm not going to even try to do that. So I want to give you a high-level overview and kind of echo, I think, what a lot of folks said this morning. The HPC component is important because it provides an area for all of you to do the great science that you're doing. We don't have enough of it. This is a constant stressor, I guess, on all of us. So we are taking steps to do that. We have a lot of opportunity coming up, and in the short term and the long term. And I think we're gonna focus on 3 different ways to do that, right? So right now we have about 20 petaflops of research computing across the country, and 24 petaflops of operational And that includes a lot of different things, right? That includes systems like JET and Hera and Fairmont and Boulder, Gaia at Oak Ridge. And then we have systems that are outside of our boundary, like Orion and Starkville at University of Mississippi State University. We also have a growing cloud component, right? So in the short term, we have a baked in kind of improvements, right? We have Gaia is going to double capacity to 10 petaflops this year. Mississippi is also growing by another 2.5 petaflops, and that should be becoming available in the short term before the end of the calendar year. We also have a number of other opportunities coming down the pipe, right? So to kind of go back to what we were saying before, for supplementals, most of the HPC that we have is fueled by supplementals, just like a lot of what we're talking about around your projects. So systems like Hera and JET and others are fueled mostly by supplemental funding, right? It's not a base funding item. So there's two tracks that we're trying to work down, right? How do we get to a stable funding profile that supports things and shortens the window of refresh, right? Right now we're at about a 5 year. Some systems are at 5 years to get refresh. We want to shorten that back down to 3. So we're again attacking this from almost 2 different funding profiles, right? Make sure that we apply the supplementals in the best way to get the biggest capacity that we can, and then build up a base funding profile that supports sustained growth without supplementals. And as we get supplementals, right, we can dedicate them to supplemental projects. I mentioned that the growth at Oak Ridge and Starkville. We have the disaster supplemental, the bill, and the IRA, which will all build on each other. And I guess we're approaching that in three buckets, right? They're all growth buckets, but they are different. They are different, and they have subtleties, right? So first one and most important one is capacity growth. How do we grow capacity past what we have now, right? So we have that opportunity, the disaster supplemental, the bill, and the IRA. So we're going to try to increase capacity the way we need it across all these different requirements that we have. Obviously, HFIP is a big part of that requirement set, and we want to work with the community here to make sure that we're, again, voicing those opinions, right? We're talking about other supplemental opportunities, ways to sustain or grow funding for your projects, and we certainly want to help do that because the computing part is important. So I've talked to Aaron a little bit about this. We want to grow that conversation. We want to make sure that we're heading towards the right requirements and growth path. So we'll continue those discussions and we'll grow that out as we can. The second bucket is software engineering, right? Capacity is a great thing and it's something that we need, but to get more capacity out of what we have and to either embrace new architectures or get more science out of the computing that we'll have in the future, software engineering is really key, right? And that's it's a not only is it a path that we need to go down, but it's a path that we need to go down together, right? We have to have engineering resources close to the scientists. They have to speak the same language. They have to be embedded in your teams. So we're looking for ways to better that. We have that now with CINA to a certain extent. We're going to grow that out and make sure that software engineering becomes kind of a strong component across everyone's programs here, so that we're making sure that we're not only getting the most capacity as what we have, but again, growing the science that we can within the bounds of the funding that we have. And the last part is facilities. We need to have facilities for computing resources. So again, we're building a facilities plan out that has growth in its future, can easily handle either supplemental or regular funding as it comes up. So we are doing that as well. So across those 3 buckets, we're trying to grow out not just the regular computing capacity, but our capability across the board. And alongside of that is a cloud component, right? We have a growing cloud component in R&D. Right now, we have three platforms that we use: Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. I think the allocations at this point are predominantly Amazon, but that's another area of opportunity, right? Along with the growth that we have in our regular capacity, right? We're growing that cloud capacity. So there's another task order this year that's in the process of being allocated. We're actually adjusting the way we do acquisitions so that we're moving that cloud time up into the into the fiscal year, so we can award it earlier. It's easier for you guys, it's easier for us, but more importantly, it gives you more capacity early in the year. So we do have a little bit of opportunity. How do we build a bridge from what we have now to what we may have in the future, right? Cloud becomes that could be part of the solution of bridging that gap. So we are adding resources there as well. And what's the goal, right, of all this, right? We want to make sure that we're continuing to grow R&D and operations to meet everyone's needs, right? I know we had issues on jet at the beginning of the season, and we worked through them, but it did impact all of you together. We want to make sure that we're growing at not only the technology, but resiliency to meet all of your needs and avoid kind of situations that we were in. So how do we build a little more reliability, whether it be across site, different technologies, but we want to make sure that we ensure that growth, right? We want to make sure we invest in those technologies and innovate so that we are, again, avoiding those types of situations, but also gaining capacity and capability, right? Through modern architectures, software methodologies. That includes cloud, that includes, a number of different areas from around the industry, but how do we make sure that we're investing so that you're successful and we're successful together? We want to build towards kind of a future state where we're simulating the Earth system for weather, water, climate protection, storms, everything, right? And that involves a lot of different new technologies that we want to integrate, whether it be AI, different types of analysis platforms, different types of computing platforms. And again, that all revolves around science, right? So how do we make sure that we're building towards that and from both of our perspectives? And modernization, right? We have different systems. They have different architectures, and there were really good reasons for them when they were built and how they've evolved. But it still takes a lot of work to move between, say, Jet or Hera or wherever. We want to make sure that we're modernizing the software stack so we lessen the burden of impact to you, right? So if you need to move, you have the ability to move quickly and not take weeks or more to get your new work started on a new site. We want to make sure that we're focusing on you guys to lessen those barriers of entry so that you can move from system to system or resource to resource without too much work. And we've tried to implement that, across the board between cloud and on-prem, and we'll continue to do that. And based on your feedback, right? There's a lot of feedback that comes from the community to make sure that we're continuing improvement, and we want that, and we want to work with you guys to make it better for everyone involved. So with that, I know I'm now cutting into your break, so I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I know we'll have another discussion on Wednesday, and I'll actually be able to be there in person. So I look forward to that as well.
Thank you, Frank. We do have one question from the other Frank.
Hey, Frank, thanks for all your support. One issue that I think has come up, particularly around with the jets, is that HFIP has kind of developed the approach of accelerating transition into operations by having sort of a test bed where we can run in semi-real time or like operations can, not in research mode. In other words, we put ourselves in the mode of an operator, and having that as a system that's very similar to the operational system is critical. And I don't think it only applies to HFIP. I think it's going to apply to the SRW. It's going to apply to the seasonal to sub-seasonal. Having the ability to, in a testbed mode, take a season and just be able to run like you're an operational environment. What we call RL8 is a critical piece. I don't think we can do it with the cloud. I don't think we can do it with an Orion. We need some kind of a NOAA cloud or a test bed that we can do that with. So I would hope that's part of, one of your buckets.
I think. Oh, sorry, Frank. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to put that on the table.
No, and I think that's a great question, and I think it's not the only place I've heard the concern, right? So I think there are a couple ways to kind of solve that problem, right? Obviously the kind of direct one is to build something that looks like operations, which it may be costly. But I think there are ways that we can look at it, and it's going to be conversation between all of us, right? It's not going to be here's the solution, right? We need to kind of figure out what that's going to look like. But I think there are ways we can do that. Kind of not virtually is not the right word, but containerized workflows, right? We can simulate different software conditions, for lack of a better term. That takes a little bit of work, right? That takes engineering, that takes working with the community here to make sure that we can get something to work, and then that starts on the software side of the spectrum, and then we have to walk towards the hardware side, and I think somewhere in the middle is where we'll meet. But I think that's a discussion that we have to continue and kind of figure out as a group, right? How we can proceed there, because I think it's a little more complicated than just adding a system, right? We need to make sure that we have the software environment that'll be conducive for what you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I just want to add that this is exactly what said Frank, is a conversation that the other Frank and I have had numerous times, and that's something that I'm pressing, again, not just for HFIP, but for everything else that OSTI modeling supports as well, and beyond. Yes, exactly. WPO as well. This is, I mean, WPO already has their test beds, but they're not structured for operational testing setting, which is my background. So that's what I'm pushing for as well. We're out of time, but I'm going to yield the floor to one question online from John Cortines.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll try to make it fast. I just want to reemphasize the importance of that the last discussion. And while I recognize, I do appreciate the willingness for everyone to work together, my worry is that we don't have a timeline for that. It's great to talk about how we need to get together, but until we have a plan for when we're going to get together, we're in pretty serious situation right now, where in order to prepare HAFS for operations next season, we're actually having to use the operational system in a way that it really shouldn't be used. And so we're now impacting operations from a transition perspective. And right now there doesn't seem to be any timeline to work towards. And so I appreciate, talking about it together, but I think the time has passed for us to just talk about talking. We got to have a timeline, and we really got to move fast, because these systems are moving forward, and we're impacting, operations in one way or another by this research.
Thank you, John. It's an excellent point, and something that has been brought up in internal conversations in Silver Spring and some areas beyond, and it's definitely not falling out of our minds. Yeah. I wish we could say we had an immediate solution and answer, but unfortunately, we're not at that point right now. I do want to mention that Frank Inviglio will be joining us later in the week. So if you do have further questions for him, you can ask them on Wednesday, or you can email them to Frank or to me, and I can relay them and get some answers for you. With that, I want to have us enter a coffee break. Instead of coming back at our scheduled 10 o'clock, let's make it 10:05 so that people have time for the bio break aspect of a break as well, because morning coffee, etc. So when we come back, it will be our forecaster needs and other conversations with NHC. Thank you.
Potentially into the Eastern Gulf and then up along the southeast coast. There's also a storm surge watch that's been issued from Broward County up to the north into North Florida. So in terms of impacts here locally, if you look at the arrival time of tropical storm force winds, looking at the earliest reasonable arrival time, which actually tracks better with the system because of the unusually large size, we're looking at hazard onset here in South Florida, Wednesday morning, and continuing obviously through the day Wednesday, and certainly partly into Thursday potentially as well. On the rainfall side, we're looking at certainly the potential for some heavy rain, 2 to 4 inches. Isolated amounts might be higher. Certainly, if the track were to change, the rainfall shift could occur if we got a farther southward shift. So anyway, it's going to be a lot to pay attention to as we go through the day, Wednesday and Thursday. And for those of you traveling, depending on when you're moving in and out of the area, there may be some impacts there. In terms of the threats and impacts here from the local forecast office, the wind threat at this point, certainly mostly on the, I don't know if that actually may not be updated yet with the latest advisory, but anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now, and we'll certainly see how things evolve during the day, but I would expect, some parts of the Florida coast will be under some types of warnings by this evening or overnight tonight. So, any questions? Got lots of aircraft going into the storm. We had the P3 fly this morning. The Air Force is flying a fixed mission this afternoon. The G4 is flying a synoptic surveillance mission starting this afternoon. The P3 is going to continue doing 12-hourly TDR missions for the next couple of days. So, and with that, we'll go back to the program here. Yep. So welcome to the session here on forecaster needs and activities supporting operations. So I'm Mike Brennan from NHC. I'm going to be chairing the session. We've got 6 talks and then some time for Q&A. It'll take us up to the lunch break. The first presentation was going to be by John Cangelosi, but he's at work doing putting up hurricane watches and helping with all that. So I'm going to go over the Hurricane Center verification talk, which is even more preliminary now that we have an ongoing system. But I'll go through that here, and that'll be the first presentation. So the preliminary verification for the Atlantic Basin. So this is the official forecast track and intensity for 2022. The track is shown in the blue line in nautical miles. The intensity is shown in the green line in knots. And you can see that the track errors actually set record low track forecast errors out through 120 hours from 36 out to 120. That's what you see in the green numbers there. You can see the 120-hour forecast error was only 136 nautical miles. So some pretty good results there. On the intensity side, we set record lows from 12 out through 60 hours with the actually even at 60 and 72, the average error was below 10 knots. Now, the sample size gets a little small, 53 forecasts verifying at 120 hours. I will note that if we didn't have Fiona, the intensity forecast errors would have been quite a bit smaller out at day 5. There were some pretty big errors for Fiona that basically raised the average error at day 5 by 7 knots all by themselves. So again, relatively small sample with some pretty big errors for one particular storm. On the sample size in the Atlantic, actually this is still going up, but basically through the end of last month, we had about 234 forecasts, actually below normal, compared to the mean of 320, and similar to a couple somewhat less active years, 2015 and 2006, although we're going to creep up with a few more forecasts here. Compared to the 5-year means, the official track forecast errors were below the 5-year means, which you can see in the black lines there at the bottom. The solid line is below the dashed. So again, pretty successful year, obviously, for setting records at most of the forecast times. That was pretty good. The climatology and persistence errors for 2022 in the red line were close to or maybe a little below the long-term mean at days 3, 4, and 5, suggesting that those forecasts might have been a little easier than typical, given the climatology and persistence performance there. The Atlantic long-term track error trends, you can see nudged down again with the record set at most of the forecast lead times. Very, very long-term improvements are very pronounced. You can see, for example, in 20 years, I'm trying to look at the right line, 72-hour track forecast error has gone from about 200 nautical miles down to less than 100, close to between 50 and 100. So again, that's just one time. The biggest decreases are out there at days 3, 4, and 5, but we're even seeing some slow decreases at the shorter lead times as well. In terms of skill, it's noisy, but the skill of the official forecast does continue to slowly, as John put it, grind higher. That's an interesting term, but it does continue to slowly increase. In terms of the guidance for this year, the official forecasts, this is a skill diagram. So up is good. This is skill relative to climatology and persistence. So skill of the official forecast in the solid black line, we're very skillful. You're seeing skill above climatology and persistence, from 36 hours on, more than 70%. And the official forecast was pretty close to the consensus aids. The consensus aids had a little higher skill at most of the forecast times, but this is like this Florida State Super Ensemble, HICA, and the multi-model track consensus. In terms of individual models, the GFS was the best model out through 24 hours, with HMON the best model at days 2 and 3. Actually, HMON was better than the official forecast at 60 and 72 hours. And COAMPS TC was the best individual track model at days 4 and 5. ECMWF in the light blue line was competitive with the best models, but sort of in the mix there, a little worse than COAMPS TC and HMON, but a little better than GFS, especially beyond day 1. HWARF skill lagged that of the GFS pretty substantially, sort of a fair performer. And as we've seen over the last few years, the Canadian and the NavGem really not competitive with the rest of the track model guidance. In terms of intensity in the Atlantic, the official forecast for the 5-year means were compared to the 5-year means in 2022 were better than the 5-year mean out through 3 days, but a little worse than the 5-year mean at days 4 and 5, like we mentioned, largely due to Fiona. The OCD5 errors are a lot higher than their 5-year means at days 3 through 5, again, suggesting that those forecasts were a lot more challenging than average in terms of difficulty. Intensity error trends, strong downward trends at 24 to 72 hours. So those continue to drop pretty substantially. But we had the longer lead forecast times, days 4 and 5 are pretty noisy against sample, a lot of year-to-year variability. Long-term trends are still downward, but again, they spiked up this year. And in terms of skill, again, pretty noisy, especially from year to year, but overall the skill is gradually increasing at most of the forecast lead times compared to climatology and persistence. And you can see now that skill above Climo is 40 to 60% for intensity, which is a lot higher than it was 15 or 20 years ago when it was basically between 0 and 10%. So we've obviously made a lot of progress here. In terms of the intensity guidance in the Atlantic, the official forecasts, again, were pretty skillful. They were better than all the model guidance out through 24 hours and pretty competitive with the intensity consensus aids through day 3, less competitive at days 4 and 5. The HWARF was the best individual model, but HMON was a little better than HWARF in the short term. The GFS was surprisingly very good, especially at days 4 and 5. And it was better than the official forecast and pretty competitive with HWARF. SHIPS and LGEM and COAMPS TC were sort of another tier down in terms of the guidance, and the ECMWF was not competitive in terms of intensity guidance in 2022. Now we'll look at the Genesis verification. So this is for our tropical weather outlook, our probabilistic Genesis forecast that we make. And this is a 3-year sample just to try to increase the sample size. So this is 2020 to 2022. And this is the 2-day verification. So we bin them by the forecast percentages. So all the low probability forecasts, 0 through 30% are binned together, and then 40 to 60% are binned in the medium category. And then the high category is anything 70% or higher. But for the 2-day probabilities, you can see they're very well calibrated. The expected development percentage is almost exactly matching the verifying percentage. And this is for a pretty large number of forecasts, especially the low categories, over 2,200. When you get out to day 5, the low and medium probabilities are pretty well calibrated. The high probabilities have a bit of a low bias, likely timing uncertainty. We're also a little reticent to really go to the very, very high numbers until we're pretty confident that Genesis is going to occur. We don't like to have too many false alarms there. And you can see that at 7 days, the probabilities are pretty well calibrated as well. Low and medium, especially, again, a similar low bias for the high category, but we're actually potentially going to go public with 7-day Genesis forecast in 2023. So considering that. So we are looking at some spatial verification for our Genesis forecast as well. This is something that Philippe Papin has worked on, where basically looking at these shapes that we draw in the graphical TWO and seeing how often Genesis actually occurs within those shapes within the given time ranges. This for the different low, medium, or high categories. So these are the Genesis forecast shapes for what became Frank in the Eastern Pacific. And you can see the star there right along 100 West shows where Frank actually formed. But you can see that the hit rate for Frank's Genesis area was basically 100%. So we had it drawn within that area, and each of the 17 graphical TWOs we issued. So we're starting to look more at the spatial verification now that we have these tools to be able to sort through that. 6 and 7 day forecasts we're making experimentally. We share these internally within the National Weather Service, but not anywhere else. You can see that we've been doing them now for the better part of the last 6 years. The track forecast errors at day, average track forecast errors at day 6 are about 250 nautical, a little less than 250, maybe 220, 230 nautical miles, and then getting up to about 270 nautical miles at day 7. The intensity forecast errors are essentially 17, 18, 19, 20 knots on average at those lead times. In terms of the percentile or the cumulative distribution, one thing we've been sort of challenged with is how do we message the longer range track forecasts with these big outliers. You can see that the 90th percentile of the track forecast error at day 7 is almost 500 nautical miles. So while your average forecast or your median forecast error is about half that. So in terms of messaging and how you would depict that and how you would convey that uncertainty for those 10% of those events where the errors are going to be really, really big is something we're still sort of struggling with in terms of how to convey that in public product. But we're still, we're looking at ideas. Any questions on the Atlantic before we go on to the Pacific? Yeah, Stan.
I'll just say real quick, a lot of times when you show, oh, sorry. On some of the plots, when you're showing the improvement, like even this plot right here, it's interesting. I can't see exactly the years. It seems like it levels off at the end. So it's a trend down. But then if you cut it off about 2015, where a lot of the tremendous improvement occurred up through that point, then it kind of levels. So it looked like that on several of the plots. So wondering if you would, and also as far as the 7-day stuff, what I would recommend first thinking of it is do it totally different type of shading and look really different. Like this is our educated guess, so to speak. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're obviously having a lot of discussions about the cone itself, even not thinking about day 7.
See, this one's level 2. Okay.
But yeah, if you look at, how you might depict day 7, you might not show an actual point. You would just show some sort of area of concern or area where the system could possibly be, but then sort of at what percentile of the error distribution do you use for that? So that's sort of what we're struggling with. Yeah, there's certainly some slowdown in some of the error trends. This is the track skill. I mean, there's still some pretty sharp downward trends in the track errors at days 3, 4, and 5. I mean, certainly slowed down at days 1 and 2, but we're still seeing some pretty substantial improvements at the longer lead times. And I mean, the intensity forecast errors themselves just across the board have on average come down quite a bit just in the last 5 to 10 years. But yes, they're very, very noisy. And but the skill is still upward, but again, mixed. And you'll see that, I think, is in the Pacific as well. Question? Another question? Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, do you see a trend in the variance of the skill? Have you been looking at that at all? Or, I mean, obviously these are mean values for each year.
Right.
But do you see a trend in that?
I don't know if that's something we've looked at routinely or not. I'll have to talk to John. He does the verification work, but we can look at that. And we're also trying to look into some more advanced verification metrics that I know like that Jason and Sarah have been working on for some evaluation. So we're trying to get beyond some of these sort of just standard statistics. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned 7 days experimental forecast. So right now, I think you probably only use the global model forecast. So when do you expect the regional model can contribute to that? Do you have any expectation because that's really, we can prioritize our development, the schedule.
Right. Yeah, that's a big challenge. I mean, there basically is only global model guidance out beyond day 5. There's no regional models. There's no statistical dynamical models for intensity forecasting. So we're sort of a little challenged by that. Some of that's just an NWP resource issue. I don't know. I'd have to defer to the EMC on sort of what they're thinking in terms of longer extension of the operational models, but I don't think it's coming in the very near future. Okay, moving on to the Pacific. Same, track and intensity errors for the season. Not a lot of records set in the Pacific this year. We did set a couple of records, at least preliminarily, at 12 and 24 hours for intensity forecast, 12 hours below 5 knots and 24 hours about 7.5 knots. Track forecast error is a little more constrained in the Pacific as well. They sort of level off, around 115, 125 nautical miles at days 4 and 5. Sample size in the East Pac this year was pretty close to average in terms of the number of the official forecasts we made, just about 320, 330. Pacific track error trends. These are, there's been less improvement here than in the Atlantic, which is, again, not surprising. The errors are more constrained. It's much more sort of climatological flow basin on average, although there are certainly challenging storms that Brad is going to talk about in the next presentation. So again, long-term trends are definitely downward, but much noisier in the short term. Track guidance in 2022 in the Pacific, the official forecast, again, this is skill space. The official forecast in the black line is, we're very skillful, but still lagged the HICA and the Florida State Super Ensemble. We were ahead of the multi-model track consensus, the TVCE, for most of the forecast lead times in the Pacific this year. The European was the best individual model, and you can see it was very close to the official forecast in terms of skill, maybe lagging just a little bit. Sort of the next tier of guidance was the GFS Ensemble Mean, and the COAMPS TC. The regional models struggled in the East Pac this year. They sort of lagged in terms of HMON, HWRF, and the Canadian. And the UK Met and the NavGem really trailed the pack in terms of track model skill. East Pacific intensity error trends. We had some downward trends in 2022, but pretty slow progress in intensity error in the East Pac. Not much progress over the last few years. Pretty noisy too, especially at days 4 and 5. Intensity guidance in the East Pac, the official forecasts had skill, certainly, but they were bested by the consensus models at those times, especially in that sort of 24 hours and beyond, especially with the, you can see the Florida State Super Ensemble was the best model out through about 60 to 72 hours, at best of the consensus age, but HMON was actually the best model individually, and actually the best intensity guidance from essentially 60 and 72 hours. HWRF was quite good as well, up there competitive with the consensus aids. Consensus aids had a little bit of a rough year. LGIM did okay, but ships really had very little skill beyond 48 hours, actually a large negative skill. So that probably degraded the consensus to some extent. And interestingly, in the Pacific, the GFS is not as good as it was in the Atlantic for intensity, and the European was somewhat skillful for intensity performance. In terms of the Genesis forecast in the Pacific, the day 2 probabilities, again, same methodology here, very well calibrated, a little bit of low bias at the medium category. But again, this is a 3-year sample, 2020 to 2022. 5-day probabilities, again, very well calibrated within about 10% of the verifying development probability. And at 7 days, pretty good for the medium and high categories, a little bit more of a low bias at the low category. So again, some of that could just be timing. But again, a sample of almost 1,000 cases, we're about 10 to 15% too low on our Genesis forecast for those systems. But overall, again, pretty successful at 7 days. And again, that's why we're considering going public with that next year. Now I'll move on to the rapid intensity verification. This was some work that James Franklin provided. And this is looking at the preliminary errors from 2022 in the Atlantic and the East Pacific of the intensity consensus in cases where rapid intensification was observed or forecast. And what you see in the black dashed line is the HFIP baseline. And the red line is the consensus from performance from 2022. So you can see the consensus errors were well below the HFIP baseline, basically below 20 knots at all the forecast lead times. But again, the sample size is pretty small, especially beyond 72 hours. We're talking about 10 to 15 cases, but that's still good to see. And if you look at and expand it out over the last 2 years, we're very, very close to the HFIP target in terms of performance for our RI cases. We're actually right at it, or maybe even a little better than it at most forecast lead times. Again, still not a greatly large sample at days 4 and 5, but close to 20 cases. So that's certainly positive development. And I think we've seen that bear out in the forecast that we've made for some rapidly intensifying storms. And I know Brad's going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. So just to wrap things up, finally, a somewhat less busy year in the Atlantic, as we still have another storm coming, but certainly devastating impacts from Ian, and also a pretty high-end event with Fiona for the East Coast and up into Canada. Pretty notable records for track and intensity errors in the Atlantic. The long-term trends are pretty well established downward for both of those parameters. No clear best winner among the track guidance in the Atlantic. For the Atlantic intensity of the individual models, the HWRF was generally best. We had a pretty typical year in the East Pac, but there were 4 hurricane landfalls in Mexico, so it was a pretty impactful year there, continuing a trend of numerous landfalling storms in Mexico in 2021. We broke a couple of intensity records there. For the Pacific, the European was the best model for track, and HWRF and HMON were the best individual model for intensity. Genesis forecasts look pretty good and pretty reliable for both basins at 2, 5, and 7 days, and some pretty promising results for RI, which is a great note to end on. So glad to take any other questions, and thanks.
Thanks, Mike. That's a great summary. You did mention a couple of things that caught my ear. One was messaging 7 days, messaging RI, messaging was a lot that came up in it. And so one of the things I want to know is how we can use our social behavioral science aspects to help you with that messaging and give us some, goals or requirements that we can push on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, there's a lot to unpack after a storm like Ian, where the forecasts were okay, not perfect, certainly. The intensity forecasts were actually really good. So it was very clear there was going to be a major hurricane threat to the west coast of Florida. The question was where. And so how to convey that uncertainty and how to convey the risk in cases like that. And that wasn't even 7 days. That was, 3 or 4 days out. Is something we really need to look at from a social science perspective. And it almost gets beyond social science. It's almost like psychology and behavioral science of how people are actually using information to make these types of decisions and what are the barriers to making decisions. So just in general, that's a big issue. And then obviously the going out to longer lead times, how do you convey that information in some sort of useful probabilistic way in terms of not just track or intensity, but in terms of impacts, and how can we kind of try to push that out, get into more situationally specific uncertainty information and getting away from climatological error distributions, or starting to blend those in. So I think those are the ways we want to try to go. But yeah, certainly working with Gina and others on the social science aspect of this is a huge part of where we're going to go forward. So, Mark?
Yeah, given how important the wind structure is to the hazards, do you ever consider adding the radii verification to NHC's routine annual verification?
Yeah, John was going to look at that this year whenever he has a chance to come up for air. And we did make, I will add that we did make experimental internal to NHC only 34 and 50 knot wind radii forecasts out to day 5, because we wanted to try to get a handle on the workload aspect of that. I think our plan is to continue that next year, but to share them internally within the Weather Service and use them for the WTCM and try to get more of that structural information in there for those at least out to day 5. So, but yeah, that's definitely something we'll look at. Yeah.
So you mentioned the East Pac, the regional model is not competitive at all. So one thing is because we are not looking at every detail of that, but you probably pay more attention on those. how can you categorize the deficiency in the regional model?
It's a good question. We'd have to sort of break it down case by case. I know that there were a lot of challenging track forecasts in the East Pacific for storms affecting Mexico. That could play into the intensity errors there. I think there were more than one case, and Brad may talk about this in a minute, where we had a left bias in the track guidance suggesting a system staying offshore when in reality the system makes landfall, and that can obviously rack up huge intensity errors. Again, the track, intensity is very sensitive to track in the East Pacific because of the very sharp SST gradient. So if you're off by just a little bit, it's pretty punishing in terms of how far poleward you get. I don't think we've had a chance to really break those down in any sort of meaningful way yet for 2022, but that's certainly something we'll look at. Anything else? Okay. Thanks, everybody. The next speaker is going to be Brad Reinhardt from NHC. He's got a presentation on forecast challenges, seasonal summary, and overall analysis. So thanks, Brad.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Brad Reinhardt. I'm a hurricane specialist at NHC. Happy to join you this morning to talk about a little bit of a 2022 seasonal summary thus far, at least, and then focusing mostly on some of the forecast challenging, some of the cases that Mike already alluded to on his talk. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So these numbers were through November 4th. So this, in this case, starting in the Atlantic, we looked at the total number of named storms, hurricanes. And actually now with Nicole, we're right at normal for the Atlantic with 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 2 majors thus far. The ACE numbers are, the ACE for this season is lower than the 30-year average ACE through this date, or November 4th in this case, when I put together the slides. That was around 78% of the 30-year average ACE. But in terms of the number of systems, we're right around average in the Atlantic. In terms of U.S. impacts, obviously the big one that everyone's aware of is Ian, making major hurricane landfall in Southwest Florida, and then also making second landfall as a hurricane in South Carolina. But Fiona was also very impactful to Puerto Rico. We had lots of international hurricane impacts as well this year in the Atlantic. So Fiona not only impacted Puerto Rico, but also made landfall in the Dominican Republic, pummeled the Turks and Caicos, also brought impacts to Bermuda and Canada, more as a transitioning cyclone at that point as well. Ian making its first landfall in Cuba. We also had Hurricane Julia hit Nicaragua, and Lisa in Belize. So quite a number of impactful international impacts in the Atlantic side as well. If we look at the East Pacific in terms of the number of storms, slightly above normal. So 17 named storms, 10 hurricanes, 4 of which became major. As Mike already spoke about, the fact that we had 4 hurricane landfalls in Mexico. So it was a very impactful season for land interests on the Pacific coast with Agatha, Kay, Orlean, and Roslyn all making landfall along the Pacific coast of Mexico. Interestingly, we also had 2 Atlantic storms that moved from the Caribbean across Central America and maintained enough of a tropical cyclone structure and crossed over into the Pacific. So the Bonnie and Julia both kept their names and moved across Central America, reemerged into the Pacific as tropical storms as well. So that's an interesting footnote for the season. Just real quick, talking about analysis, challenges. And really, I think the highlight here is that in the absence of storms close to land, so in the absence of aircraft data or, buoy and surface observations, we really rely heavily on the low Earth orbiting satellite data. And we've continued to see, diminishing coverage and quality of that data in recent years, where we've had several satellites, some microwave imagers and scatterometers that have gone offline. Most notably, this was our first full season without the METOP-A scatterometer. And so leaving us with just B and C, which have a very similar footprint. So we're seeing a lot more data gaps over the open ocean. And I just took this image as kind of an example of, when you got a system that you think something's starting to come together and you'd really like to know what that surface wind structure looks like. And, this happened all too often this year where it fell right in the middle of the data void, and we don't get any information, sometimes for several cycles at a time. I mean, sometimes for a day, day and a half, we may not have a lot of information. So Also several of the existing microwave imagers are at or beyond their planned mission life. We only have a couple that provide the higher resolution 36, 37 gigahertz imagery. So one of the continued challenges just in the analysis phase of tropical cyclones, especially over over open ocean, sorry. And so now I'll transition because the rest of this talk is going to focus on forecast challenges. And so I kind of broke it down into some broad categories to start, and then we'll dive into some more specific examples for particular storms towards the end. But just starting off with Genesis in general. So we'll start in the Atlantic. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. This is a verification plot that's taken from the TC log guidance. It's basically tropical cyclone Genesis guidance that is produced from global models using logistic regression models. And so this is one of the tools that we have when we're generating our Genesis probabilities for the tropical weather outlook. And so this plot here shows model consensus verification. So each one of these symbols was where there was a model consensus signal for TC Genesis in the Atlantic Basin. And so the circle indicates that Genesis did occur within the 5-day period in this case, and the X Genesis did not occur. And I just kind of use this for illustration to show that we saw an excessive amount of false alarms for Genesis this year. In the Eastern Atlantic particularly, you can see a lot of X's there on the screen. I will also note that the colors on this graphic, the warmer colors indicate a higher Genesis probability that was indicated by the model consensus. And so you can see that there were quite a number of false alarms in the Eastern Atlantic. We also saw a good amount of false alarms in the Northwestern Caribbean as well as the Eastern Caribbean. A lot of those were contributed by the GFS, which has just had a tendency to tend to spin up more cyclones than any of the other global models. So, when you're making your Genesis forecast, obviously, it can be tough with a lot of false alarms to make sense of, okay, when is this signal really indicative of something versus just, maybe some noise. And so we'll take a look at a similar plot now, but I broke it out. The top graphic shows the verification for the GFS, and then the bottom for the ECMWF in the Eastern Pacific. And one thing that we definitely noted this year was that there was a large amount of GFS false alarms noted offshore of southern Mexico, kind of east of 100 degrees west. Particularly at time periods where climatologically you wouldn't expect to see that kind of development. So in some of those cases, we were able to kind of use that knowledge to temper our probabilities and our expectations for what developed. Mike kind of hinted at this with the verification that sometimes with the Genesis probabilities, and the verification, it can be a timing issue. So maybe some of those false alarms for the GFS might have formed, but it might have been a day 6 or 7 instead of within the 5-day like the GFS was showing initially. But in any case, that was one of the things that we noted for EastPac Genesis this season. So going on to the next forecast challenge, potential tropical cyclones. So this is, something that we've been able to utilize since 2017 for systems that don't currently have the structure and meet the strict scientific definition of a tropical cyclone, but we do expect Genesis to occur. So actually our first 2 Atlantic storms this year started as potential tropical cyclones. PTC-1 moved across South Florida and into the Western Atlantic. PTC-2 moved quickly across the Southern Caribbean. But you can see that in both of these cases, both of these systems took a long time to develop. And actually these were the longest issuance of PTC advisories before Genesis since we started in 2017 was for these 2 systems. So you can see here on the graphic, I've got the first cone graphic that we issued for PTC-1 and PTC-2, and I annotated a red star on there to show where Genesis actually occurred. So you can see with what became Alex, it didn't actually become a tropical storm until it was out over the Southwestern Atlantic. It had already moved across, South Florida. And PTC-2, 88 hours, it took 88 hours for Genesis to occur from the time of our first PTC advisory. You can see it occurred there over the Southwestern Caribbean shortly before, moving across Central America. So what I will say, one thing to note for the first one, the system that became Alex, was even though it took a long time to develop the well-defined structure to become a tropical cyclone, I do think the PTC advisories in that storm really helped us amplify the rainfall messaging, because we did have very heavy rainfall, over a foot of rain in parts of Miami and surrounding areas, and some pretty significant flooding from that. So I think in this case, it was an aspect where the service provided was good, even though the genesis occurred maybe a little bit later than we thought it would have initially. And we also had PTC4 in the Gulf of Mexico, which maybe nobody remembers because it didn't actually develop. So it never developed a well-defined center and failed to undergo genesis before it moved inland just as a trough of northeastern Mexico. And that was only, I think, the second time in the Atlantic that we've ever had issued PTC advisories for a system that did not eventually become a tropical cyclone. So just something to note there. All right, rapid intensification. So this is a fun one. Mike showed some really, good, some promising results looking at, the overall cases. And so I'm going to show some specific examples for a few storms that, and it's not all negative, but just to, show some of the challenges, some of the successes and shortfalls for the season. But just looking at it as a whole, rapid intensification. So we had numerous cases in the Eastern Pacific Basin. In the Atlantic, we only had Ian that met the 30 knots and 24-hour criteria for RI. But we'll, take a look at a few of these now, a little more in depth to see what happens. So the next few slides keep similar structure to them. So on the left side of the screen, you can see this is just taken from our operational forecast system plot. This is a plot of different intensity guidance aids at the particular time step. In this case, for Hurricane Darby, looking at the July 10th to 12 UTC. I know that it's small on the screen, but you have access to the slides, and the details for specific models aren't necessarily what's important here. I'm just trying to kind of show the overall envelope of what the intensity guidance was telling us at that time. And then on the right side, you can see a table that shows the kind of a matrix of RI probabilities from ships. And so with that, the warmer colors indicate a higher percentage chance of the storm meeting a specific RI threshold at that time. And so Hurricane Darby was a case where if we look at the intensity guidance, we can see that, there's a signal for some modest to maybe steady strengthening, but certainly not what occurred, is what you can see with the best track, the line there in white. So this was a case where RI occurred, but was not explicitly forecast by us. And you can see none of the ship's RI numbers really jump off the page at you. And if you just look at the satellite imagery there in the bottom right corner, on the left, it didn't look particularly, ominous. Still looked a little, broad. Maybe it had some work to do to develop that intercore structure. And I think the satellite image was maybe 24, 36 hours later, but you can see what it became, a major hurricane in a very short amount of time. So this was a case where RI occurred, we didn't explicitly forecast. So looking at Hurricane Estelle, which was another East Pac hurricane, where you can see here, looking on the left side of the screen, the guidance was fairly aggressive. And I mean, some of the ship's guidance and others, even some of the multi-model consensus aids were explicitly showing rapid intensification. If you look at the RI probability matrix, you can see that the ship's RI numbers are a lot higher than what we just looked at for Darby. So this case where we felt reasonably confident. I mean, if you look at the satellite image on the bottom left there, certainly looks like, a storm that could be getting ready to undergo RI based on our assessment. So we actually did explicitly forecast RI for the system, but you can see from the white line on the intensity guidance plot that RI did not occur. In this case, Estelle was a very small storm, and the moderate shear was just enough to really keep it from getting that tight intercore structure and, insulating it from the dry air surrounding the cyclone. So in this case, it didn't undergo RI, but we, had forecasted it. But then, to finish up with a good example of Ian, and that was a case where RI was forecast and did occur. So if we look at the intensity guidance there's a very strong signal for significant strengthening of Ian during the next several days. This was from the September 25th 12Z model cycle. And obviously we all know what happened. So this was a success case where, the RI was forecast and it did occur. All right, and so now I'll go into some examples from a few specific storms and some of the challenges that they pose. And I'll start with Hurricane Fiona, which came up several times in Mike's verification talk. And I think Fiona, had a couple of different challenging aspects to it, really starting with its genesis. So we originally added the disturbance that became Fiona to the tropical weather outlook on September 6th. It ended up being dropped a few days later. And I think there was it was a little bit unclear. There were maybe a couple of waves or disturbances in fairly close proximity, and it was unclear like which one might become the dominant feature. We did reintroduce the area that became Fiona into the tropical weather outlook on September 11th, but only ended up providing 69 hours of lead time in the tropical weather outlook before genesis occurred. So not horrible, but certainly not optimal either. We would like to, have a stronger signal. And you can see there from the animation there, the disturbance that's further west. You can see it kind of goes right from the medium category and then, genesis. So that one formed a little bit more certainly than we were expecting before it reached the islands. Now, success from Fiona was the track. So our track forecasts were comparable to or lower than the mean official track errors for the previous 5 years at all forecast periods. So that's really good to see. I mean, the plot on the left there, all the blue lines are official NHC forecasts, and the white line is the operational best track. And you can't really see the white line because it's buried under our forecast track. So we like to see that. That's good. So it's not all bad. The track was handled well for Fiona, but as Mike alluded to, the intensity was problematic. Really starting from the beginning, early forecasts really only showed modest strengthening when it was over the Caribbean due to the expected negative influences of some dry air and moderate shear in the area. And nonetheless, the black lines, vertical lines there on the screen indicate the time when it made its landfall in Puerto Rico and then the Dominican Republic. So if you just kind of compare the white or the best track to where our forecast, you can see all of those blue NHC forecast lines are generally below where the storm ended up, making landfall at. So it was able to quickly strengthen into a hurricane before it made landfall in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. Whereas our forecasts were generally calling for a, 50 to 60 knot tropical storm, say. And then Fiona also moved over the Turks and Caicos as a major hurricane. And so again, our forecasts, while they did call for some strengthening, more strengthening occurred than what we expected, despite the presence of some continued moderate deep layer shear. So again, you can see a lot of the blue lines for Fiona in this case, the forecast intensities were below what it ended up moving over the Turks and Caicos as, which was a 100-knot hurricane. And so really overall, this led to long range, larger long range NHC intensity forecast errors, much larger than average. And we saw that in the and how that impacted our verification numbers, especially given the smaller sample size as you go out further in time. Let's see. Oh, might have lost my clicker here. Let's see. Thank you. All right, so we'll go on to Hurricane Ian next. And so I'll start with the intensity, which we already kind of talked about. So the fact that Ian's rapid intensification was generally well forecast over the northwestern Caribbean Sea and the eastern Gulf of Mexico. What wasn't as well forecast for Ian from an intensity standpoint was the fact that with it moving offshore and then strengthening again over the southwestern Atlantic, that was not really well forecast. And I worked several of the days for Ian, and I remember that for a number of days we thought that the system was generally going to move, remain inland and gradually spin down. But I think the UK Met might have actually been the first model that kind of consistently showed it swinging back out over the southwestern Atlantic, intensifying, and of course, as we all know, that's what ended up happening. So that was a source of some intensity error for Ian, because at that point, a lot of our forecasts showed a pretty steady weakening trend as we thought center was going to remain inland. So if we look at the skill plot for Ian's intensity, overall, the NHC forecasts were quite skillful, beating most individual models and even some of the consensus aids, as you can see our official forecast there in the solid black line. So I think this was a success for me in that we, consistently showed Ian becoming a major hurricane over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. We tried to highlight that at the time in discussions and whatnot. It was kind of an interesting case where normally with the stronger storm, you're more confident in the track and maybe less confident in the intensity, especially if you're, expecting rapid intensification. In this case, we were relatively confident about the fact that it was going to undergo rapid intensification. But as we know, the track provided provided its own challenges. So if we go to the next slide. So this is just, and again, I know that Ian track, I mean, that could be the source of a whole talk in and of itself. So this is just going to be very high level given the interest of time. But what I did here was I just broke out in 24-hour periods a bunch of the different track models and aids that we could use operationally at that time when we're making our forecast to show kind of some of the general trend. So this is starting on September 23rd at 12Z, which I think was right after, I think the first advisory was issued overnight at 9Z. So this is very early on in the process and or in the event. And you can see that if you just took kind of a broad center point of the guidance consensus at this point in time, that, you know, that matches up pretty well with what actually happened, which is the white line denoting our operational best track. And if we step forward, you can see, okay, on September 24th, now you start to see this westward march across the Eastern Gulf there, especially led, of course, by the GFS, as well as, you know, some of the HWRF and HMON runs as well. If we go forward again, see some of them go a little bit further. Even the models that, like the European and UK Met, that ended up being closer to reality, but there was still kind of this westward trend in the entire envelope, which of course brought our NHE official forecast in that direction as well. And if we go to the next one, now you can see, okay, things are starting to focus, coming to a better agreement, but they're still to the north, generally kind of, you know, focus near the Tampa Bay region, still to the north of what ultimately happened. And then if we go to the last time step there, you can see finally by the 27th, you start to see model solutions converging, but at that point we're, you know, pretty close to landfall. So, and so this just shows kind of depicts it in another way. So on the left, you can see all of the NHE track forecast for Ian in blue, as well as the best track in white. And then on the right side, might be kind of hard to see. So it might be better if you pull it up on your laptop or whatnot, but you can see the black lines are all of the GFS forecasts tracks for Ian. The kind of pink or salmon colored line is the European, and white again is the best track there. So you can see that in general, the European was a lot more consistent, had less spread overall, although it did have, I mean, there was a time where it actually took it across, you know, South Florida, much further south of what actually ended up happening. I think maybe even bringing it close to or east of Miami. But, you know, compared to the GFS, which obviously had that much larger spread and a lot of solutions that took it well, you know, tracked it towards the Florida Panhandle. And so if you go back to the left, you can see the NHC forecast never got nearly as far west as what the GFS showed, but nonetheless, you know, the GFS and HWRF, HMON being, you know, contributors to the multi-model aids definitely, you know, pulled us in the wrong direction, unfortunately, for a day or two there. All right. So yeah, the NHG track forecasts were more skillful than the GFS, but were bested by some of the consensus aids and some of the individual global models, European and UK Met. This is a good time to point out too, that this was just kind of focusing on where, you know, kind of the cross track errors or whatever. For the sake of time, I didn't do a lot of statistics on the, didn't have really time to look at the along track errors, but that was also a significant source of problem with Ian, was that, you know, there were, the models had a significant slow bias, particularly I think the UK Met was extremely slow with it. So it can be a little misleading to just look at it in terms of that and make draw all your conclusions about, you know, the Ian track. Also do need to look at the, you know, long track errors as well. But if we ask, okay, how did our track errors compare to average for Ian? And we go to the next slide. This is kind of the standard table that we use in all our tropical cyclone reports. So you can see through the first 48 hours, just, you know, 12 to 24 hours, a little better than the 5-year mean, pretty comparable to the 5-year mean at 36 and 48. Really, the largest forecast errors were kind of that 60 to 96 hour time period, where the official errors were somewhat above what our 5-year mean was. Not terribly, but, you know, certainly compared to past, you know, major landfall and hurricanes that we've had, like Ida and Laura, where, you know, we were much more confident in the track forecast. You know, these errors were larger than some of those past events, and then at 120 hours lower than the 5-year mean. Okay, and so the last one I'll talk about is Hurricane K, which was the East Pacific one, and I think Mike already kind of hinted at some of this. But if we go to the next slide there, we noted that, you know, our forecast for K had a slow and left of track bias. as evidenced here with all of our forecasts in blue compared to the best track in white. And if we go to the next slide, this is a plot that John, who does our verification work, actually produced this for me, or for us, for the unit, because we were, talking about this. There was some conversation, and so he broke it out to where you can look at both the along track and the cross track bias for our forecast in black, GFS in blue, European in red. You can see that all of the lines fall below that solid horizontal black line, the center of the plot. So everything to the everything below that line indicates a slow and left of track. So we saw it reflected in the GFS European and of course in our official forecast. And if we advance one, so we actually took a look, John took a look, he kind of within that box, looked at a sample of storms over about a 10-year period for storms that moved past near Baja California, and wanted to see was there some kind of persistent bias that we note there. And so he ran the numbers. This is the same plot now, but instead of just for K, it's for that sample that he looked at. And indeed there was kind of a slow and left of track bias noted the sample of storms from 2012 to 2021 that he looked at that fell within that geographic area. So that was something that was done. I think it was sparked by some conversations that we had in operations, and it was good that he was able to do this work and kind of make us aware of it, so we can be cognizant of that. Maybe it's something that we can look more into in the off season in the future. But K was just one example of a situation where we had some difficulties with the track, and as Mike alluded to, with your track and intensity being intrinsically linked there, it can be pretty punishing if something makes landfall a lot earlier than you expect from an intensity verification standpoint. So, all right, well, that's all I had. Thanks for the time, and I can take any questions.
So yeah, that's an interesting plot, especially the one that John did showing the left of track for pretty much everything. Do we have any idea why? I mean, we saw the same sort of bias. You showed it with Ian too. Is there something going on in the models that is forcing this situation?
I mean, yeah, it would appear that way. I haven't looked as carefully at it, but it's something that I think we would like to continue to explore this off season, because now that we have a larger sample that shows. I mean, I don't know, Mike, do you have any thoughts or ideas? But
I'll just add that I think that left of track bias problem in the East Pac's been around for 30 years. I think it may be topographically related. I mean, it could be model resolution and how the models handle the topographic interactions there. And not even just in that box, but along the west coast of Mexico, we have topography right up against the ocean. You see a lot of very strange behavior in global models in terms of how they track developing or existing tropical cyclones into that region. So my guess is it's topographic, but I don't know if anybody's ever done any definitive research on it, but that's a long-standing issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. So just to follow up on that is, I mean, just someone who's involved in it, but not doing the forecast like you guys are. I thought it was an amazing forecast. I mean, we're 10 days out, the storm hadn't formed off of South America, and you had basically the track pretty much right a week and a half out ahead. So, getting a long track forecast as it's going parallel to the coast is always going to be incredibly difficult. And as your stats showed, you're actually still under for 12 hours and 24 hours, the average forecast.
Right.
But this left of track, which again, more on Ian now, before I realized that, I'm thinking it's a little bit depressing, because if you're going to have the most data dense area, it's over the continental US. And that's essentially where you're going to get those track areas, you would think, coming from. Either the trough is too fast, not strong enough, or in another case where it'd be a ridge, whatever. So that's a little depressing, because it's like, that's probably as good as we can do as far as data density, and we're still having problems with that.
Yeah, yeah, and I know the model evaluation group at EMC did a really good talk a couple weeks ago. I don't know who saw that, but I know the slides are available, and I thought it was a very comprehensive assessment of all that. But you're right. I mean, even in real time, I think we were talking about that as we had special soundings going up and synoptic surveillance flights and things, and we still took a little bit longer than we thought it might for to see the GFS kind of converge with everything else. And so yeah, it was tricky. Certainly, as you said, complicated by the fact that it was moving roughly parallel to the the west coast of Florida as it made it into the Gulf. And I just know that during that event, we were trying our best to talk about our confidence in a strong hurricane, but when we still were not as confident with the track. And obviously there's products where we can convey that in our discussion and our key messages. Even watches and warnings help to do that, because we can be more we can issue that watch for or warning for a larger geographic area to highlight the uncertainty, but the fact that there's a risk for a long stretch of the coastline. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, I think we still fall victim to the cones sometimes, and the fact that it's such a successful product, but it can kind of be people's default, or maybe in some cases the only thing they look at. And so just something we have to continue to work on, and I'm sure we'll look at it as we do at the end of every season, and see what we can do better for messaging purposes.
Yeah, quick question on your thoughts on any emerging skill in forecasting the eyewall replacement cycle. Do you think there's any hope that that would help your intensity forecasts in the near future?
I would think it certainly could. Yeah. And I mean, I think we've seen some, cases. I know there was talk that the eyewall or the double eyewall structure with Ian was, forecast. And I know there's some products out there that kind of can help try to diagnose that in semi-real time based on recent microwave images and stuff. So certainly that, has impacts on short-term fluctuations to intensity. And so I'd see a lot of, value in that if we can continue to, expand our capabilities in that arena. Yeah, I think it would help a lot.
Yeah, I had one question, which is, watching the progression of the model forecast for Ian, do you think that the land interaction with Cuba is part of what the models were getting wrong? And, it seems like, it's a short time before it hits Florida, but also maybe that's part of why it starts jumping and locking onto a different track, that it got that wrong.
Quite possible. I mean, I know even in real time that day, we noted that it stayed over Cuba longer than we thought it would. And when it came off, it was coming off at more of a northeasterly direction than, pure northerly. It's kind of what we were expecting. So yeah, I think that's a good, it's good insight. And yeah, that probably did, play a role. And I know the EMC talk also covered that, because I think when it was over its trek to the Northwest Caribbean, I think the GFS was better in the first couple of days for that, if I remember correctly. And so, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complicated influences. Yeah, land interaction is certainly one of them. I agree.
So I have a different take on Ian.
Okay.
There was one part of the GFS guidance that actually had a very good track forecast for Ian, and that was COAMS TC, the GFS based. Same initial conditions. It's started off the GFS. The physics are different. And I strongly suspect there's something there in maybe the interaction between convection and shear that was driving, there was a driving factor there. I don't know what the physics are in COAMPS, but I would suspect they're different than the physics in the INCEP guidance. So I think that's something to look at.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. And obviously we all know this will be looked at heavily in certainly as we get into the off season and, going forward, it'll be a very interesting research topic.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jason, about the importance of physics versus, or in addition to initial condition. But I had a question about, going back to the question about ERCs and Mark's question to Mike about the wind field. In the case of Ian, or any case for that matter, I think really highlights, again, the importance of structure verification. I know it's hard to do. We don't maybe have a reliable best track on that, but as far as the hazards and the ultimate impacts, I think getting the wind structure right, in addition to intensity track, of course, are other key aspects of the verification we should try to do.
100% agree. It's definitely on our list. I had conversations with John last off season about, and unfortunately we just keep getting bombed with storms and TCRs, but I'm hoping to maybe have a little more time to help him out with that, because especially now that we're doing these experimental, ones out to 5 days, I think it would be a good idea to get kind of a baseline of where we're at. Even like you said, some cases you have aircraft or scatterometer that can help refine, other times you may not, but at least to get a feel of error bars on how we do in terms of the structure verification, I think would be really important.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment on the model performances. I think it's tempting to attribute why certain models did better for you and not others. The left of the track versus right of the track, the challenging aspects of it. Like if you look at Fiona, for instance, we have a right of the track bias. And if you look at Yan, GFS, other models have left of the track bias. And you mentioned CTCX. Yes, they're doing different physics, but is that the reason, or is it just exacerbation of the model biases in those directions? And the same thing with the slow and fast moving biases. I don't think they are necessarily attributable to physics. It's more complex than that. Let me just leave it there. But I think, the one that you showed about the box or Baha and persistent biases that can be documented will be definitely a great resource for the model developers to look at it into, because those systematic errors can be addressed. They're not random errors. They are consistent, they are persistent, and they can be looked into, whether it's topographic interactions, whether it's the stratiform clouds that are forming there and preventing the models to resolve the actual convection. Those things can be looked at and addressed. And I think that's a great input that I saw from your presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll pass that along. It's good to know.
Yeah, one more.
So I know you showed the along track and cross track biases in the box. How does that compare to the mean along track and cross track biases for the entire East Pacific?
That's a great question. I don't have that information, but I'm expect John could, run that for us.
Okay.
We could, try to
'Cause
follow up with that.
I was wondering if that's different than the basin scale biases or if that's just
Yeah,
similar.
right.
to the entire
Overall,
basin.
yeah. That's a good point. I'm not sure if you ran the same numbers for the entire basin, but yeah, we could look into that. Certainly. Yep. All right. Thanks, everyone.
I just wanted to make a quick announcement for those of us that are here in the room. Lunch is sponsored and will be from roughly 1 to 2:30. It's a Mediterranean buffet. I believe it's in this room, or is it not? Okay. It's out the door. Okay. Okay, so it's over by the restaurant. Great. Thank you. And I don't know if you call it here, Jenny, but it will be served out by the restaurant area, and you can sit anywhere at the tables in the lobby.
Thanks, Aaron. No pressure to get people to lunch fast. So Dave Zielinski from NHC is going to give an NHC technology update here from the technology and science branch. Dave.
Thanks, Mike. And based on that good news, I'll try to play my little part to get us closer to being done at 1. So this is going to be a little different. It's still going to be an ops summary, kind of like what Brad and Mike touched on as well. But I'm going to cover the gap between most of you in the room who are doing the research and the forecasters. And I've actually played both of those roles in my career. So I feel like I have a good handle on both communities. Let's see, do I advance this? There we go. All right, so just a few things we'll cover. You'll see them as we go. I do want to cover briefly some updates to the technology and science branch at the Hurricane Center. Currently, we don't have a branch chief. It was, well, if you go back long enough, Mark, who's in the room. Brian Zachary departed in July to move to a new position. So currently our acting branch chief is Wallace Hogsett, with Stephanie Stevenson acting as our science and operations officer. Actually, at the end of next week, we will be doing a shuffle again, and I will be the acting branch chief with Matt Anderlandy taking my role as team lead. Where I'm going with this is just like several of the last few years, TSB has been short-staffed again this year. We're at probably around 60%, about 2/3 strength. And that is with continued busy activity, continued hybrid on-site and remote operations with COVID and so on. Storm surge, you'll have a chance to learn more about storm surge later this week. And I did want to acknowledge, of course, we have a couple NHC local people Ben also was recently our diagnostician, now more formally in the SIRA group. Next slide. So before I get into this year, I do want to do a brief overview because I think it benefits everyone to get a reminder of the software that the forecasters are actually using on site when they're making their forecast. And there's three basic software platforms. AWIPS 2, which is primarily used by the entire weather service to make forecasts. When you go to weather.gov and you point and click and you put in your zip code or your favorite airport, and it gives you that 7-day forecast, that's all done in AWIPS 2. NCEP traditionally hasn't used that as much, but we are in the middle of an effort to transition heavily to AWIPS 2. We use something called NAWIPS. It's the National Center's version of AWIPS. And that is still used for warning collaboration. We're all now under a tropical storm watch here. That coordination was done in part in NAWIPS this morning and in part in AWIPS 2. It's possible as soon as next year that will be done exclusively in AWIPS 2, which will be nice. And then there is the ATCF, which is software that is shared with the Navy. Levi is going to give his summary in just a little bit here. They are making their forecasts the same way we are. Brad showed a whole bunch of example plots from that. Next slide, please. Input sources. We get data from a lot of places, but when you boil it down to what we can support operationally, and that is something that's going to get 24/7 support, that's always going to be available to the forecasters, or at the very least, everything within our power, it will be available to the forecasters. These are the sources. So NCO manages a lot of that data, things like model data from the supercomputers, our ATCF models that run there, some of our satellite data and so on. I don't need to read this whole list because I know you'll have access to this presentation, both the slides and I guess the recording later. What I want you to do is remember that this exists. So just remember, you can come back to this as a resource. And if you want to know how does NHC get satellite data, you can look it up on this slide. If you want to remember how we get model data, you can look it up on this slide. And if you can't find it, you can always email me afterwards. Next slide. So output. Obviously, you're all familiar with the Hurricane Center website. I've been looking around the room and there are very few laptops here that have not gone to the Hurricane Center website so far this morning. I have two on my phone. However, NWS also has a number of other formal transmission methods, including everything from radio fax, which is a way of transmitting graphics through literally fax format. This is something I learned this year. I'm always learning new things, that fax files are not images, they're not text, they're their own unique things, .fax file, and we transmit those. Like I said, come back to this when you want to know how we transmit something. It's there for your reference. Next slide. Maybe the most important one. So because we are so limited and we've had sort of this revolving door of people in TSB recently, we've been short-staffed, we're really continuing to make an effort to boil down what we support. That means we're only supporting, for instance, for new code, bash for shells. We're not doing C shell, we're not doing K shell, we're not doing all the others. There's nothing wrong with those. I encourage you to use whatever you're most comfortable with, but if you want it to run at NHC, we want it in bash. That way it is consistent with everything else we do. Likewise, the most important thing here for input data formats. I know both at this meeting and in the weeks coming up, we're going to be talking about requirements, for instance, for aircraft data. Eventually, things like TDR is going to have to be supported by NCO through an NWS official channel. TSB can't support that indefinitely. I suspect AOC would probably say the same thing. There's a lot of things that are great, but need to make it through that final, make it across that final threshold, I guess is the best way to put it. Next slide. So in 2022, what did TSB do? Well, we wanted to be doing more research operations, but we spent most of the time working on our AWIPS transition. During this past year, we underwent multiple major migrations that included basically the virtualization of our entire AWIPS computing infrastructure on site. You don't really need to know what that means, except for the fact that it took all of our time. And that was what we did. I mean, truly, for months and months and months, almost my entire team was focused on just getting our AWIP system to continue to function. The result of that, if you go to the next slide, was this, which was taken during Hurricane Ian. And from your perspective, NHC's forecasts continued to work like normal with no change. For us, that was a major milestone just to get to that point that we continued that we continued to have the ability to issue forecasts. But that's where we are right now, where we're using multiple platforms, software that's sometimes and sometimes not really centrally supported by the Weather Service. So for TSB, Ian was a really big success, I think. The fact that we went through one of the biggest migrations that I've ever seen at NHC from a technology standpoint, and then immediately went into the busy part of the season, and it went well. Big success for us. The other one that I would be remiss if I didn't mention is the transition to WCOS 2. I don't know if that'll come up later today some, but the Hurricane Center, we had to migrate not only how our models run on WCOS 2, but how we communicate with WCOS 2. So all of our data flow was basically rewritten from scratch. And there's a table back there with the people that did the majority of that work. Next slide, please. So these are some of our FY22 milestones. I just want to cover a little bit because, we got to do maybe a little bit of new stuff. And I do want to highlight that. In terms of looking forward to FY23 and onward, I believe on Wednesday during the hot section, the Hurricane and Ocean Test Bed, we're going to talk a lot more about the future. So Wallace and Stephanie, they will do the fun parts. I'm just going to talk about what has already kind of happened. The two that I will focus on here, because this top one, statistical post-processing, Mark is going to give an update on that as part of the CIRA talk. There will be some updates from Storm Surge as well. And then, of course, the test bed will get its own section on Wednesday. So what I want to talk a little bit about is just our migration to AWIPS, and then also a brief update on graphical products for external users. There's an example of that. Next slide, please. You can go on to the next one. So AWIPS 2. And if you've been a regular member of HFIP, you'll remember I actually stood up here in this, not this room, we were in a room around the corner, talking about AWIPS transition the first time I gave this talk pre-COVID in like 2019. And we're still doing it. And we're going to continue to be doing it. I'm going to give you this slide like 2 years from now, and it'll probably still be up here in some form. The exciting thing here is that actually just last week, for the first time, TAFB forecasters ran a product from AWIPS 2, saw the preview, edited it just like they do now outside of AWIPS, and sent it to an internal server. So from a forecaster standpoint, end-to-end success. First time we've done that. Once that's done for one product, you'll see it for a lot more. So we're actually finally making some progress, and that big virtualization project I mentioned, we use that as an excuse to really harden a lot of our data sets that come into NHC so that we can support them forever, which is why, remember that slide that I said, burn it into your memory. If you want to know where NHC is getting our data and where it needs to come from, go there. We're actually doing it ourselves now for the first time in really a long time, and I think pretty successfully. So again, use that. Next slide, please. Here's some example products. I grabbed these from just last week. The ones on the, let's see, the ones on the top came directly from our website. The ones on the bottom were made by our forecasters. And I would argue the ones on the bottom are both technically identical, but they look a little better, which is nice. Next slide, please. All right, and this is the other one I wanted to briefly mention. Go ahead to the next one. So one thing that NHC is looking at, and I believe there may be some more about this in Wallace's talk or Mark's talk later, is looking at intensity at landfall. Right now we have products like the wind speed probabilities and so on that give you maybe points, but aren't necessarily as useful on, say, a state level of what is the worst that you should prepare for instance. So one project that's going on right now, it's ongoing social science research, is to look at a landfall probability, landfall intensity probability product. And if you go to the next slide, there's a couple examples from that. I forget, Wallace, if you're in the room, which one of these is the most recent iteration. But these are being evaluated. The idea, again, being that you can see for different regions, it gives sort of a most likely and maybe a reasonable worst case scenario of what the strength of the storm could be at those locations. This is something that if you are sitting in this room looking at the forecast for Nicole today, I have a feeling every single one of you would be looking at this very interested to know, especially those of us in Miami, to know, maybe what is the worst case you should be planning for your house, or whether you should be planning to fly home early or delay your flight a day and so on. So you can see the immediate applications, and for emergency managers, this is something that will be particularly useful. And that is just about all I have. Some brief sort of less exciting things that are coming up. We're going to be continuing migration work over the next year. You're going to hear a lot of, whenever any of you that interact with TSV, you're going to hear a whole lot of NAWIPS to AWIPS 2 transition. That's because we're continuing to go forward with it. Farther in the future, perhaps we will get down to just one platform. There's still an NWS project to sort of consolidate everything into AWIPS 2. From my perspective, as sort of looking at shorter range, I want to get off NAWIPS first, so that at least all of our collaboration and so on with the rest of the weather service is on one platform. But one day we'll get there. Another one I want to highlight is HAFS and AWIPS 2. Right now, I think there's a gap between the modeling community and sort of how the forecasters look at models. With the most recent GFS upgrade, not the minor one that's being evaluated now, but with version 16, where they actually changed a lot of the grid files, the AWIPS 2 field was unprepared. And I think most of the offices lost the ability to view the GFS entirely because there was no communication. What I would like to challenge the community is see if we can find ways to help NHC view the model data and so on in AWIPS 2 in our platforms that may be rigid. And it might be that the model output is the thing that has to change because there are limitations in the software. But right now it's sort of just on our group to figure it out. And that's not sustainable. It hasn't worked out. We don't have the ability to view HWRF in AWIPS 2 right now because we couldn't figure it out in a way that was stable for the rest of our operations. So maybe that's something that we can think about in the future going forward. And that's all I have.
Dave, you mentioned the model output. Is it because I just catch the last few words?
Oh, yeah,
The model output you want to change. What type of the format, data format, AWIPS 2 or AWIP you need?
So there are others in the room like Stephanie back there who are much better AWIPS experts than I am.
Mhm.
However, my high level understanding is that AWIPS doesn't like moving nests. It likes static grids.
Okay.
So maybe we need to produce a static grid that has a whole bunch of zeros and just has a little moving nest in it. And that is something that could be baselined into AWIPS. That might not be the most elegant solution, but I'm just throwing out there that there may be needs for things like that.
You tell us the requirement, we make it to work.
Yeah.
How about that?
From my perspective, This, I'm not sure I can speak for everyone in TSB when I say this, but from my perspective, the requirement is that we are handed a baseline version of AWIPS that already works without us doing anything. And I don't really care how it got there. Now, I do care that it works, right? But there's probably 10 different reasonable ways to get the HWRF to, or the halves down the line to work in AWIPS 2 in a standard way where both NHC and a local WFO can look at it. But I don't want to have to be the one that figures that out because I got 15 other problems to worry about. Yeah, so my requirement is that what I'm trying to say is my requirement is that you reach out to the AWIPS office without me, if that makes sense. Like take me out of the equation until the end. Yeah, it absolutely is.
Two things, Dave. First, after seeing you describe the AWIPS transition and WCOS 2 on top of it, redoing code that has been is legacy for 15 years is pretty amazing. So that's a credit to you and table 7 back here.
Table 7 gets all of the credit.
Is there any chance for a breather this year so we can get back to some of the a little bit more of the transition? There's a lot of things like waiting in the wings that are ready to be implemented on WCOS 2 and locally at NHC.
Yeah, so we're in a period now where there is no formal mechanism preventing us. Last year there was a moratorium, and I know you're probably gonna touch on that with the guidance suite. We couldn't make updates to ships and LGEM like we would in most years because we could not make scientific changes to code. The only thing we were allowed to do is get it to run on WCOS 2, essentially. And the same thing affected, the global models and the regional models. This year, we don't have that in place. So we do have an opportunity to make updates. Where we are short on essentially is people to do that and do the more fun things of what's going to come in 2024 and 2025 and so on. It's not that relevant to the talk, but you saw we still have a couple of vacancies. My wife and I are having a baby in January. We're going to create sort of an artificial short-term vacancy in the spring. And when we only have a team of 6 for our primary development group, you lose 2 people and it's a huge thing. So yes, there are definitely going to be opportunities. And I know Wallace and Stephanie are going to talk about those in the context of like the hot. But it may be a 2024 thing more than a 2023, just because we've kind of have this backlog of things that need to continue to happen for us to get there, I hope.
Okay, yeah, and one just a quick suggestion. I think there's a couple of new JHT projects starting up, and I think maybe Jordan Dale's in here somewhere. But it might be good for the slide you showed on the infrastructure that NHC wants to stick with BAS scripts and so on. If that could be conveyed to the new JHT project people, they don't have to do it that way, but it'd be good to get that guidance right at the beginning of the project.
For sure.
So the next presentation is going to be an update on operational storm surge modeling from Andy Penny and Laura Alaka. I guess they're virtual.
Yeah, can you hear me, Mike?
Yeah, I hear you, Andy. Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, are you going to drive the slides?
I would just say next slide and they can drive it for you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about some recent updates to the storm surge modeling at the National Hurricane Center. And first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues in the storm surge unit especially Laura Alaka, who helped put these slides together. Next slide, please. So our primary guidance that we use for forecasting storm surge at the Hurricane Center is probabilistic in nature, and it's called P-Surge, and it's based on the slosh model. So it's really an ensemble of slosh forecasts, and slosh stands for the sea, lake, and overland surge from hurricane model. And slosh is a hydrodynamic model that is very computationally efficient. We can run hundreds, if not thousands, of simulations within the 1 hour time window that we have available for operations on WCOS. And probably the most important thing is how the meteorological forcing is specified for slosh. And right now that's done through a parametric wind profile. So it's not really able to handle any wind asymmetries aside from those due to storm motion. So the P-Surge ensemble attempts to account for uncertainty in the forecast parameters, both in track, intensity, and then also in RMW, which those are separate forecasts. Right now, the number of cross-track members varies from run to run, and it's really dependent on the RMW. It's because the cross-track spacing is set to be 1 RMW apart. We use 7 members for the long track component of the ensemble, 3 members for intensity, and then 3 members for storm size, which is just basically the RMW. Next slide, please. So I think Hurricane Ian was a good example of why probabilistic guidance is crucial for storm surge forecasting. These track forecasts are from the, sort of the standard suite of track models that we look at. And this is at 0Z on the 26th of September. This was when the storm surge watch was issued for parts of southwestern Florida. So if you look at the track models, most of the guidance was bringing Ian northward over Cuba and then towards the Big Bend area of Florida. The exception really, I think, was COAMP's TC, which based on the GFS model, and it really had great forecasts, I think, for track for Ian. But I think it's fair to say that Ian was kind of right on the edge of the deterministic track guidance envelope, if you will. Next slide, please. So the P-Surge ensemble is shown here on the left for track, and it's based on the official forecast. And even though, Ian was sort of on the edge of the guidance, you can see that the ensemble is still able to encompass the actual storm track here. And then just to sort of show what the intensity and the RMW members look like for this particular forecast, you can see the intensity is shown on the top right panel in red. And so for this case, the intensity spread was from about 90, 95 knots to 125 knots at the peak intensity at 60 hours. And then the RMW ensemble is shown on the bottom right panel for the small, medium, and large size storm. Next figure, please. So if we move forward to 18Z on the 26th, this is when storm surge warnings were issued from just north of Tampa Bay southward along the west Florida coast. And again, I think this sort of time you could look at the output from a single deterministic track on the left based on the official track forecast at this time. And it would give you a misleading view of sort of which areas were at highest risk for storm surge. So in this case, really only the Tampa Bay area was highlighted for a significant threat to storm surge, just based on a single deterministic run. But if you look at the full P-Surge ensemble on the right panel, this is the 10% exceedance of in feet above ground level, you can see that uncertainty was still very high at this time. And so really most of the West Florida coastline was at risk. And certainly we, the ensemble did a good job of highlighting the area that was impacted the worst near Fort Myers. Again, you can see the best track here, the solid black line on the right was, just on the edge of the P-surge ensemble guidance. Next figure, please. So if we look at some observations from this event, these are high water marks from the USGS. And I think what's really striking is the sharp gradient in high water mark values near the storm's RMW. So especially if you look at the values near Captiva, all the way to the eastern end of Sanibel Island, I mean, they increased quite a bit, and then on to Fort Myers Beach. So a number of high water marks greater than 12 feet above ground level. Next slide, please. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I just want to kind of talk about how we evaluate updates to P-surge to see if they're skillful or not. We have a verification set of 25 storms that go back from to 2008 to 2020. And this really spans the time when we have good USGS pressure sensor data. We also use NOAA tide station data as well. So we take each one of these forecasts and then we determine when landfall occurred in these forecasts, and then match those up to the lead times of 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, and 72 hours. And this allows us to evaluate some of these metrics as a function of lead time. And we're most interested in evaluating the probability fields of greater than 3, 6, and 9 feet above the NAVD 88 datum. So this figure here with the tracks shows the set of 25 storms in our verification data set. And then on the bottom panels, those are distributions of intensity on the left and RMW on the right at landfall for these cases, just showing that we've got a wide variety of storms in the data set. Next slide, please. So when it comes to comparing the forecast values to the observations, this is just an example figure that kind of shows how that's done. This is from Hurricane Laura at 24 hours prior to landfall. And you can see the forecast probabilities here of exceeding 6 feet above datum are in shading. So there's an area near the coast of 80% or greater of exceeding 6 feet. And that sort of tapers off as you move inland. And the red stars here show observations that were greater than 6 feet, and the black stars are observations less than 6 feet. So we find, we match up the corresponding grid points from the model output with these observations to create forecast observation pairs. And then those are used to fill out contingency tables where we can derive different statistics. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. So one of those, statistics that we look at comes from the ROC curve, and the ROC curve compares the probability of detection on the y-axis with the false alarm rate on the x-axis for different probability of exceedance thresholds. So here the 0.1 corresponds to the 10% exceedance. And again, these figures are showing for probabilities greater than 6 feet above datum. And so version 2.7, which was an older version of P-surge, we're comparing that here to version 2.9, which is the current operational version. And that incorporates updated RMW forecasts. So one of the metrics that we look at from the ROC curve that sort of takes information from both the POD and the false alarm rate is the area under the curve. And we can use that to, as a metric of how skillful the forecasts are. And so if you look at the area under the curve for version 2.9 at later lead times, 60 hours and 72 hours, those are better than the similar metric from version 2.7 at 48 hours. So these RMW forecasts really help to improve the P-surge forecast, especially at later lead times. Next slide. We're also looking at the threat score, which tries to evaluate how well the yes forecast verified. Here version 2.9 is in green. Again, that's the current operational version. And then 2.7 is in red. And a higher threat score is better. You can see that at the 48, 60, and 72-hour lead times, and for all the different exceedance thresholds, version 2.9 is better. And then the Breyer score is another thing that we've been looking at, attempts to answer the question of what the magnitude of the probability forecast errors is. And here a lower score is better, and you can see that version 2.9 outperforms 2.7. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a little bit here, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're hoping to include in the next version of P-surge early next year. So this would be P-surge 3.0. And one of the big ones is including non-uniform bottom slip coefficients or Manning N values. This is something that we don't have currently in the operational version. So we've just used a static value that's the same for each slosh basin. And so you can see the impact of using these Manning N values in these figures here on the left. This is version 2.9, so the current version. And you can see the high probabilities extend well inland. So in essence, there's a lot of water being pushed too far inland in the current operational version. And then in the bottom left panel, you can see that we still have high probabilities near the coast, but they drop off rapidly as you move inland. Looking at this another way, if you sum up all of the, or take an average of all of the storms in the retrospective data set, you can see that the number of grid points based on the 10% exceedance of exceeding 6 feet above datum. So here the purple line is P-surge with Manning N values, and you can see that we're really reducing the number of grid points that are being highlighted by this 10% exceedance value. Next slide, please. So if you look at the skill of the Manning N forecast based on the threat score and the Breyer score, and you compare those to the current operational version. So Manning N is the purple line, and the current operational version is in green. You can see that they're very similar in terms of threat score and Breyer score. So we're reducing the inland extent using these Manning N values, but we're not compromising the skill of the forecast at all. Next slide, please. Another thing we're hoping to incorporate into P-surge 3.0 is an adjustment for landfall. There are times when landfall occurs between forecast points, and just because of how the interpolation works, you end up having a low bias for intensity and a high bias for RMW. So if you look at the example forecast from Hurricane Ida here at 12Z on the 26th of August, you can see that the interpolated landfall intensity was 76 knots, which was much too low. And so what we're hoping to do is hold the pre-landfall intensity constant up until landfall. So that would be the green line, or 95 knots here. We also experimented with extrapolating the pre-landfall trend, but it seemed kind of squirrely, and it didn't provide consistent results. So if you look at the figure down on the bottom right, this is from Hurricane Michael for a series of forecasts, and this is the intensity at landfall for these different forecasts. And so if you just use the interpolated value, you can see that it really oscillates back and forth from forecast to forecast. Again, that's the blue line. And if you hold it constant, that's the green line. And so it really provides more forecast to forecast consistency when we try to correct for that. Next slide, please. We're also adding 2 new basins to PSearch 3.0, one for Puerto Rico and one for the US Virgin Islands. These are really large basins, lots of grid cells, and we're going to be coupling those to a simple wave model. It's a second generation wave model that's based on the Great Lakes wave model. And it's very computationally efficient. So it's a good model to couple to SLOSH. However, just because of the nature of the grid sizes and then the cost of coupling the model, we are needing to do some code optimization to help speed that up so we can have these runs done within the operational time window. Next slide, please. And then further down the road, we would like to be able to get away from using the parametric wind profile to define the meteorological forcing. One idea is to use a two-dimensional wind field that would allow us to handle storms that have an asymmetric wind structure, sort of like Ada did here. This is from 2020. And this is especially important for early and late season storms. I mean, Nicole's a good example of this right now. And we're also hoping to explore whether we can use ETSS, which is the extratropical storm surge model, to specify the solution away from the tropical cyclone or the immediate tropical cyclone environment. So sometimes you have maybe a frontal boundary where you've got enhanced wind flow or onshore flow for a while that wouldn't be handled by PSearch. So that's another thing we're exploring. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, just to summarize, I think Hurricane Ian was a good example of why we use probabilistic guidance. And it really helped to identify the areas that were at greatest risk for storm surge. We use a 25 storm data set to evaluate new upgrades to PSurge to see whether they're going to provide skill or not. And those go back to 2008 and extend to 2020. We haven't added storms from 2021 or just yet. And showed that recent upgrades to PSurge in version 2.9, where we use improved RMW forecasts that really helped PSurge at longer lead times. So some ideas that we have for including in PSurge 3.0 that'll happen early next year. We'd like to add the Manning N bottom slip coefficients, again, to reduce the inland extent. But I also showed that it really doesn't hurt our skill values for those forecasts. And then we're going to be adding grids for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands and coupling those to a simple wave model. And we're hoping to also correct for the low bias and intensity and high bias in RMW that's caused due to the interpolation at landfall. And then down the road, we'd like to be able to specify a 2D wind field for input wind forcing, be able to handle wind asymmetries. And then something we've talked about for a while, but being able to also incorporate dynamic uncertainty information to generate the PSurge ensemble. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Andy. Questions in the room for Andy? Or online?
Hendrik here. I raised my hand. I don't know if that works. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Hendrik.
Yeah.
Hey, Andrew, love your review of, as you know, I'm a very strong proponent of doing anything with waves and storm surges from my history alone. Completely in support of the fact that the way we are setting up these kind of systems in terms of having the biggest uncertainty in the forcing and not in the physical models. But at some point, we do need to get back into a discussion about how we're putting together this PSurge ensemble, because some of the work that Notre Dame presented shows that if we do this not by main uncertainty, but do a smarter way of sampling the uncertainty space, we could do this with a much smaller ensemble. And I would love to go back into the discussion about whether or not we really want to reinstate the old Great Lakes wave model, because that's the model that we actually retired more than a decade ago. And I understand the reasons why, but I would like to have that discussion in a little bit more detail. That's way too much detail to do right here, right now. But I would like to have that discussion because it does kind of force us to start maintaining multiple wave models again, which is one of the things that we try to avoid. So that we have to have a good argument for that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hendrik. I appreciate your comments. Yeah, that would be good to set up a discussion where we can talk about these things for sure.
Hey, Rob?
Yeah, Andrew, about your under future work, the first bullet point about specify a 2D wind field to account for asymmetries, you incorporate motion, as you mentioned, but I think another driver of asymmetries is often vertical wind shear. Would a simple, and maybe this exists already, would a simple parametric model that incorporates motion and shear in terms of predicting where the asymmetries would that be helpful for what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that's definitely, a route that we could explore for sure. I don't think we have to be, set on using a wind field or 2D wind field from a particular source. So yeah, that would be definitely an avenue to look at.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Andy? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
So our next presentation is by Alex Lambers at the Weather Prediction Center with an update on WPC rainfall forecasting for tropical cyclones. Alex, you able to hear us okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure can. Sounds good. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Lamers. I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the Weather Prediction Center. And today I'll be talking about rainfall forecasting for tropical cyclones, which will include common challenges we face and a few products we use at WPC. I won't be able to cover everything, so feel free to reach out with any questions afterward. Another good point of contact would be Jim Nelson. I think he presented last year from our development and training branch. He wasn't able to make it this year. Next slide. So is it advancing? I don't see it advancing on my end. There we go. Yeah, so devastating rainfall events from tropical cyclones have, unfortunately, they've been quite common in recent years. And this chart just shows the coverage of the 10-inch rainfall area for individual 24-hour periods for the main chunk of hurricane season. And so you see the dates there along the x-axis and the years along the y-axis. And as you can see, 10 inches of rainfall at scale almost exclusively occurs from tropical cyclones. We've had at least one notable case each year since 2015. This hasn't been updated for 2022 yet, but Ian will eventually show up on here, as you'll see in the next slide. So we can look at that. And that will show a grid of a variety of tropical cyclones. Not seeing the next slide yet. There we go. In fact, so Hurricane Ian, as you see here, it produced the third highest coverage of 10-inch 24-hour rainfall in the past 16 years. The 10-inch area isn't, of course, the only useful metric that we could evaluate, but I think it does provide a good sense of when devastating rainfall amounts occur at scale. And so you see a lot of the dates in the top 10 happened between 2016 and 2018. That's a pretty active period. But the basic takeaway here is that we've had some enormous TC rainfall events recently, and you'll see a lot of notorious storms in this list. Next slide. So a big challenge we face in forecasting and communicating the rainfall threat from tropical cyclones is that every storm will produce some rain. So simply saying that a tropical cyclone is expected to bring rain is pretty obvious to most people with at least a passing familiarity with tropical cyclones. And it sort of invites a so what response. Of course, a select few storms will produce catastrophic events, and those are the ones that we really need to get right. And also get the message out as widely as possible. A lot of times, this may be the most rainfall or resulting flooding that a lot of people in the area have ever experienced. So personalizing the threat and crossing the threshold from, it's going to rain a lot to you are in a lot of danger can be difficult and a messaging challenge. And in between those two extremes, many storms have these localized hotspots where significant impacts can occur. But there's a lot more uncertainty, and it can be tough to motivate a large response in advance. And that's a pretty common issue that we see further inland. Next slide. Perhaps the biggest control knob on rainfall potential is forward speed. And that's true along the entire spectrum of storm organization and intensity, because all else being equal, of course, a slower storm will lead to more rainfall. We try to be cognizant of the forward speed to set reasonable expectations on the true high-end potential of an event. It may not seem like a lot, but there is a huge difference that we see all the time between a storm that's just crawling along at about 1 or 2 knots and one moving slowly but steadily at 6 to 8 knots. And that will lead to drastically different durations of extreme rainfall rates in a particular area. We saw a lot of that spread with Hurricane Ian, that some models were producing prolific rainfall, even more than what actually occurred across Florida, and those were the ones that were really quite slow. And regional differences are important as well, of course. A slow storm in the Northeast may be closer to average or fast for the Gulf Coast. So we have some climatological forward speed maps that we use for reference, but I think it is worth considering whether there's better ways to directly visualize and quantify storm forward speed in a more comprehensive way across the tropical suite of products and data sources, and on ensemble data plots. The example I have on the right here is a nice map from Tomer Berg during Hurricane Ian, showing different coloring for ensemble members based on central pressure. And finding maybe ways to do displays like this, different kinds of charts that factor in forward speed, could be even more useful for us grounding the forecast in terms of how reasonable the high-end potential is. Next slide. And appropriate context for recurving storms is very important. I think Irene in 2011 is a classic example. It was moving about 17 knots as it passed by the New Jersey coastline, which might seem pretty fast, but the average forward speed in that area for recurving tropical cyclones is about 25 knots. So quite a bit below, clearly below average forward speed. And of course, rainfall amounts of 5 to 8 inches. If you message that along the Gulf Coast, that wouldn't be a huge deal in most cases. But in New England, of course, it produced devastating flooding and exceeded the 100-year average annual recurrence interval. Next slide. Another tricky situation is extratropical interactions that help enhance and focus rainfall. This is pretty common during recurvature, but we do see interesting patterns like we did with Joaquin in 2015, where an amplified trough over the southeast helped siphon moisture off the hurricane and focus it over South Carolina. And rainfall maxima that occurs some distance from the actual cyclone itself may not actually be associated with something like an official hurricane warning, are often difficult to message and anticipate and forecast. That can be an issue with storms even outside the U.S. in the Bay of Campeche and Western Caribbean, especially those that emerge out of the Central American gyres. So that's an area that may deserve a little attention as well. Next slide. In terms of predictability challenges, as I mentioned, it doesn't take a large, intense, or extremely organized storm to necessarily produce prolific rainfall amounts. I think the contrast here between Imelda and Harvey in Southeast Texas shows this pretty well. Both storms had several feet of rain between Houston and Beaumont, but of course, the smaller and less organized storms will present a less obvious rainfall signal in the model guidance, which tends to reduce lead time, and the narrow rain bands can lead to extreme gradients and impacts. So increasing our ability to sniff out the big events with the less organized storms is something that's potentially pretty useful. And high-res ensembles have helped with that to a certain extent. Next slide. I just mentioned the extreme rain gradients, and a classic example is Allison in 2001. You can see it had several feet of rain on the northeast side of Houston, but less than 5 inches in the same county, in the western part of the same county. And so visualizing and communicating this potential is a challenge, as you can all imagine. Next slide. And another source of predictability challenge is when models fundamentally misrepresent the future storm structure. And this is really a pretty common issue, I think, when the disturbances are in the outlook or pre-tropical cyclone phase, but they're still close to land. So some sort of rainfall forecast is required when the storm has not even formed yet. So Barry in 2019 is a good example. A lot of models showed the storm developing convection close to the center early on and consolidating in inner core, but that never really happened. And Barry was still moving fairly slow, and intense rainfall did occur in narrow bands. Arkansas actually set their state TC rainfall record in this event, but the intense rainfall bands actually occurred outside of where the global models projected it. You can see there was very little overlap between where the GFS and the European model had it the day prior to landfall and where it actually occurred. So we can have these cases where we're pretty confident there's going to be a locally extreme event, but it's very difficult to trust that the models are putting it in the right spot. And of course, we're reliant on that model guidance to blend in and generate the forecast. And it's always a little nerve-wracking as a forecaster to put out a forecast of an extreme event where you don't have practically any model support for that. Next slide. Okay, so that was a very quick and basic overview of some common challenges we face, and now I'm going to just pivot real quickly to the actual forecast that WPC does. We do have a fairly wide responsibility, both in topics and geography, and the key in this presentation is going to be the area you see in red. So we coordinate on rainfall information for all storms covered by NHC and CPHC, and the international desk will also come into this presentation there in purple. They provide some IDSS for USAID, and they help coordinate rainfall information for other countries and for tropical cyclones. Next slide. And this is a grid that just shows the variety of different rainfall forecast products from WPC vertically on the page and horizontally showing which lead times they're valid for. I think the one that most people are familiar with are our QPF, which goes day 1 to 7. We do produce a zoomed rainfall graphic that begins when a storm is within about 84 hours of a close approach or landfall. And you see that right now with Nicole if you went to the NHC homepage. And those tend to include about 3 to 5 days worth of rainfall in the graphic. There's probabilistic QPF for the next 3 days and an extreme precipitation monitor, which compares QPF to average annual recurrence intervals. And the bottom 2 products are more related to rainfall impacts, which is the excessive rainfall outlook, which goes out 5 days now. We're considering the ability to do that out to day 7. And that is a graphic that will also show up on the NHC homepage, hurricanes.gov. And then there's the mesoscale precipitation discussion, which is event-driven and targeted for more immediate flash flood threats. So I'm going to get into a couple of these, but I'm not going to cover everything. This is more here as a reference for kind of what we do in the rainfall realm. Next slide. And this just quickly shows where WPC information shows up on the main NHC website during an active storm to give you an idea of how our information is integrated. And we coordinate on the rainfall statement and the public advisory and any rainfall related key messages, and that includes both US and international areas. For US areas, we'll also produce that zoomed graphic that I talked about for both QPF and excessive rainfall outlook. Next slide. And a substantial change this year to the QPF forecasting is that we're doing a live demonstration of a collaborative forecast process. This isn't to say that we didn't collaborate previously, of course, but this is more of like a formal process that has specific deadlines and timeframes to meet. And it's a method by which forecasters from the local level and WPC work together to come up with a single NWS QPF. So the details on this graphic aren't too important. I just sort of grabbed it from a broader NWS presentation. The main thing to understand is that WPC starts with the 1 UTC and 13 UTC NBM national blended models as a starting point for the night shift and day shift respectively. We provide targeted edits on significant changes that are needed, and we collaborate those edits with the local forecast office. And for tropical cyclones, edits may be more necessary as we try to stay true to the official forecast scenario, and there can be some differences there with the NBM. Next slide. In terms of rainfall forecast performance, I believe Jim Nelson presented about this last year, but it's worth revisiting as we have some slightly updated statistics and visualizations. And I think displacement errors of our QPF objects in tropical cyclones is a neat way to evaluate rainfall forecast performance as it mimics the way that the track forecast is evaluated. And we use the mode software to calculate the differences between observed and forecast rainfall objects. The graphic you see to the right is a 3-inch rainfall object for Hurricane Ida, but we have them for a variety of different thresholds and storms, and then we aggregate it over many cases. Next slide. So the updated error statistics now include quite a few 2021 cases as well, but we're still at the point where really only the 1-inch, 2-inch, and maybe 3-inch QPF objects have a sufficient sample size to draw more robust conclusions. at all forecast lead times. So I presented the average errors for the 2-inch contour in the table here. And those errors are very close to the 5-year average track errors for the entire Atlantic Basin, if you went and looked them up. And the graphic here is just an example from Hurricane Sally. At a 60-hour forecast projection, the heaviest rain was forecast over southern Mississippi and southern Alabama. And the centroid of the 2-inch rainfall object, the purple coloring here, is in a similar spot. But the average error, of course, at that time is about 100 miles. We don't really have a cone for rainfall, of course, but if you were to sort of try to visualize it, that would mean the core of the heavy rain could have been anywhere from southeast Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle. And indeed, in this case, the heaviest rain did fall in the western Florida Panhandle. So this is kind of also a neat way in real time to sort of help message where and how far away from where we're forecasting it the heavy rain could actually end up. Next slide. A new thing this year as well, Ben Albright in our development and training branch took a look at the directionality of the errors and presented it in these charts that you see here for day 1 to 5 for 2-inch rainfall objects. And we have more thresholds available as well. And as you can see, there's considerable bias for forecast rainfall to be too far to the west and southwest, or essentially too far into the prevailing westerlies aloft that we usually see in and around the US. Cooler colors indicate smaller displacement magnitude and warmer colors indicate larger magnitudes. So you can see that errors tend to grow with forecast lead time, as you'd expect, but also larger errors tend to occur in the usual direction off to the northeast. And if you'd like to see these statistics in greater detail, let me know. This is just the tip of the iceberg here. Next slide. And this is just a basic conceptual model showing a theory as to why you see the displacement errors the way that you do. Around the time of landfall and thereafter, we often get dry air wrapping into the western semicircle of the storm, and shear vectors are often from a westerly direction. And we also tend to get more significant instability to the east of the storm center. So putting all that together, and we saw it with Hurricane Sally, it's common to see the significant convective rain bands with more intense rain rates situated east of the center and further east than models often indicate. So keep in mind that we tend to use guidance as the basis for our rainfall forecast. So this isn't likely just a human forecaster bias. We are incorporating all that model guidance as well. Next slide. As we move off of the rainfall forecast, I'm just going to close with some of the impact products, impact-focused products. So one that's grown in importance is the excessive rainfall outlook, which provides the chances of rainfall-induced flash flooding. It's mapped into 4 risk categories: marginal, slight, moderate, and high. Because the product is probabilistic, it doesn't exactly match QPF, and it does attempt to account for a wide variety of factors. Things like antecedent conditions and rainfall rates are quite important. So it's not an explicit forecast of flash flooding at a specific location, but it's more of a situational awareness and planning tool. And I'm not going to have time to go into a deep dive in the verification stats, but the probabilities are reliable. We see that in our verification efforts. And we did recently in the last year update the probability definitions. The original definitions were conceived at a time before we had high-res model guidance, and we're really able to pinpoint areas far more accurately as we are now. Next slide. And so for a long time, the ERO has only been available for days 1 to 3, but it was experimentally extended to day 4 and 5 this year. And it has the same general look and feel. The major difference has been that we only included the slight and moderate risk levels while we've been issuing it so far. Similar to how SPC, the Storm Prediction Center, does their severe weather outlooks. But we were internally testing the marginal risk level for potential future inclusion, and it is reliable, the verification shows, so we are likely to include that when it goes operational. So essentially, we would have a consistent look and feel for all 5 days, and that'll likely help the visualization in those zoomed graphics you see on NHC's website. I have an example here from Hurricane Ian. You can see a signal showing up on day 5, and keep in mind at that time range, there was still considerable track uncertainty, so that's why you likely only see a slight risk, even though there was potential for a significant event. Next slide. And one basic thing we see in terms of impacts as they relate to ERO risk categories is a significant percentage of total US flood fatalities and damages occurring on days in which a high risk is in effect. And this measures the total regional scale event. So any incidents that occur on a high risk day within the high risk area or adjacent moderate and slight risk areas are included here. But it is a way for us to say we're pretty confident on those days it's a potentially damaging and deadly flash flood day, and that's how we've been messaging it to our partners. Next slide. This is just an example from IDA, and it shows the general progression. You can see a moderate risk was issued as far in advance as we could at the time. We didn't have a day 4 and 5 outlook at the time, so the first chance we got, there was a moderate risk for the New York City urban corridor, and they hadn't seen a high risk in a decade at the time. And of course, high risk upgrades more than 24 hours in advance are quite rare, only about 2 per year on average. And so the rainfall forecast for this case was somewhat unusual, but maybe it wasn't quite eye-catching. It was a broad swath of 3 to 8 inches. But the ERO considers all those other factors, like I mentioned, and so that did increase our confidence to go with the high risk in this case. Next slide. And this is just an example of visual verification in a high risk area from IDA in the Northeast. And I include it here because it illustrates, I think, a few key principles. So the coverage of warning and reports does tend to go up in the higher risk categories, but it's not all about the high risk, of course. We had an early warning fatality in the DC suburbs here, which were in the moderate risk area. The flooding issues are not necessarily evenly distributed across the risk areas. Again, the product is probabilistic. And so you see a lot of the issues were along the southern periphery of the high risk in the urban corridor in this case. And while warnings were issued elsewhere, there were fewer reports and the rain rates were also generally less extreme. Next slide. And the last product I'll briefly touch on here is the mesoscale precipitation discussions before wrapping up. And again, these are areas issued for areas where there's a growing flash flood threat in the next 6 hours. The forecasters are just continuously evaluating a wide variety of data sets and integrating that and producing a product that's intended to highlight these areas of growing concern. And we're currently evaluating internally ways to make the product more quantitative and probabilistic, maybe with a little data table of probabilities, and to fold in rainfall rate information more explicitly as there's growing information in that, or growing interest in that information. Next slide. And this is just another example from IDA, probably the most strongly worded MPD we've ever issued. You can see it was issued a few hours in advance of the first flash flood warning for New York City. That's a time scale we try to live in with this product, a few hours before things really escalate. That's the goal. And there was a little hatched area that you can see in red there in the middle of the main scalloped area, where we were trying to highlight the potential for significant flash flooding. And we even mentioned the possibility of flash flood emergencies in the I-95 urban corridor. And unfortunately, that's what happened. And this is a product where rainfall rate information is really important. We really lean on the high-res models. Next slide. And coming to the conclusion here, just a reminder, we coordinate rainfall statements for all storms within the solid red outline here, which is the NHC area of responsibility. Coordination occurs with the National Water Center on the specifics of flooding and hydro impacts for US areas specifically. But I just throw this graphic up here to make the point that our need for reliable rainfall information extends to many areas outside of the US as well. And evaluation of the performance in those areas is important as well. And next slide. And this is the second to last slide I have. So the international desk, important to note because although it's primarily a training desk for visiting forecasters from the Americas and Caribbean through a partnership with USAID, they do produce guidance forecasts regularly for tropical cyclones, but even outside of tropical cyclones. And they've provided Puerto Rico QPF support since Hurricane Maria, but it is a valuable source of expertise we can tap into, and they coordinate with our senior forecasters when they're preparing those rainfall statements. And next slide, and this is the conclusion. I just wanted to summarize the sort of the overall needs and things that we see as things that would be particularly useful. So at the top, you'll see the QPF and QPF-based products and tools that I highlighted earlier. NHC forecast error reductions would have natural benefits for the rainfall forecast as well. Again, seeing how closely those are linked. Improvements in the reliability of information on storm structure and shear profiles, especially beyond 48 hours, could have benefits in correcting for the typical displacement bias that rainfall forecasts have, and in evaluating model performance in the context of that bias, I think would be really cool. Forward speed is an interesting way to ground the forecast in exactly what the high-end rainfall potential is, and improved availability of that information rather than sort of having to do a back of the envelope calculation every time would be helpful. Of course, any improvements to NBM would help, as that's our starting point now. And it may be worth exploring options for probabilistic rainfall graphics, which could be a more reliable way to communicate rainfall information at longer lead times. In the bottom section for the impact focused products, you'll see rainfall rate information is really key, including at sub-hourly timescales. Thorough evaluation of rain rates in both hurricane models and high-res models and tropical cyclones be very useful. And probabilistic information is always welcome, especially if it's rooted in useful thresholds like exceedance of flash flood guidance or annual recurrence intervals. And thanks for your attention. And I can take questions if there's any time left. Otherwise, feel free to reach out over email.
Thanks, Alex. Frank's got the first question.
Yeah, Alex, nice summary. The one thing I see on your needs is the definition of the type of actionable timeframes and products, thinking about the social behavioral economic interactions here. What do our customers really need? You showed us day 3, day 2, day 1, and then for the flash flood, you got 3 hours. Are those actionable timeframes that our customers want, or what we can do? I think we need to think that way. I also like you talking about improvements in NBM, because I know you don't put hurricane models in there. And from our HAFS work, we're seeing it's competitive, if not doing better in some cases than GFS. So, with track forward speed is a key, as you pointed out, to rainfall. Are you considering that, or how can we help you do that?
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first, which is about the hurricane models integrating in NBM. I think if there was a way, even situationally, to get that folded into NBM, that's potentially one avenue. I don't know what MDL would say about that, but I can't speak for them. Otherwise, I'd say finding ways to get it into AWIP's GFE, what we're using to actually produce the QPF forecast. If it's there, we'll look at it. We have a lot of QPF data coming in all the time. So I think it's really making that connection with our development and training branch, and opening up the pipeline. And if the information's there and the forecasters know that it's available and it is competitive in these situations, then they'll take a look at it, particularly if it sort of closely mimics what the NHC forecast is projecting. And the other part on social and behavioral science, I totally agree. I think, that is a question. Actually, we have somebody from the social behavioral science group here today, shadowing, learning more about CFP and our forecast products. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, I think we actually did run a survey once at ICCOH just to see, like, when would you use the excessive rainfall outlook, for instance, for decision making? And I think people mostly responded in that day up to day 5 timeframe, but there were a few people that said day 6 and 7. And we've seen the excessive rainfall outlook in particular get folded into action plans a lot more. So we know it's being used. It's being used for broadcast meteorologists, and it's being used to make on the ground decisions. So understanding that to a greater degree, we would welcome any sort of study and look into that. We're trying to capture that as much as we can on our own, but any help with that would be certainly welcome.
Yeah, Alex, is Mike. I think that's a great point. I think we're in the space where we're not sure exactly what kinds of decisions people are making, and it varies very widely. It's not like, storm surge has this institutionalized utility for making, community scale evacuation decisions for tropical cyclones, but we're not really there yet for rainfall. And I don't know, maybe Alex, you could touch a little bit on how you might see the rollout of, FIM, dovetailing with the efforts here, not just getting the rain and the flash flooding, but trying to potentially outline where you might have inundation.
Yeah, and I think our partnership with the Water Center is going to be really important. They're going to provide the hydro expertise, and they're really trying to get into the detail, the on-the-ground detail of where is the water going to actually be. That sort of more mimics what we're doing in the storm surge realm. And so I think I see them as complementary pieces, like the excessive rainfall outlook and this other guidance is really trying to raise that large scale signal of, like, okay, we're pretty confident in this. This is going to be potentially a big deal. And then in order for them to make decisions on where they're putting resources, who they might need to get out of harm's way and that sort of thing, that may come down to more detailed on the ground modeling, either before the fact, like where are the low-lying parts of our area, or in actual real time, like if we were to get this amount of rainfall, where would it flood? So I think that partnership's going to only grow. I know they're targeting, they have a goal to get it out to 10% of the country in the next year or so. And then beyond that, it'll only expand. Yeah, and as one example, we've heard New York City in the wake of Ida they're actually gonna use the excessive rainfall outlook as a basis for some decision points. And that obviously a big city in the United States. And so we're not hearing about everything, all the ways that people are probably using these products. We're trying to find out as much as we can, but we don't have visibility into everything. And like you said, Mike, it's not institutionalized to the degree that storm surge is. So it's probably being used in different ways. There's not a systematic way that it's being applied. And understanding those differences is pretty important, I think.
Any other questions real quick for Alex? We'll move on. Okay, thanks very much, Alex.
Yep, thank you.
And the last presentation here in this session is going to be by Levi Cowan from JTWC on JTWC forecast tools, challenges, and priorities. So here you go, Levi, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Let's see, how do I click forward? Okay, thank you. Well, clearly this meeting, impeccable timing with the hurricane watches being issued. I feel like I have two devils on my shoulders, one anxiously wondering if I'll make my flight out on Thursday morning. The other one saying, what do you mean? This is awesome. So we'll see. Obviously, I hope it hits, but does nothing somehow. That would be nice. So if you don't know me, I'm Levi Cowan. I'm the senior scientist at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center out in Hawaii. And we obviously do a lot of the same sort of things that the National Hurricane Center does, but more catered toward our customer set, which is more the Department of Defense and over a much larger area of the globe. I want to talk today about a few of our significant forecast challenges. I'm going to focus mostly on rapid intensification, which is a pretty obvious one that we all struggle with in the operational forecasting realm. But I'll just mention here that, a couple of the other things that we're really thinking about are things like TC genesis, which kind of plays into the RI problem because RI often happens in the Western Pacific in particular, immediately following genesis, and those can be some of the most challenging events to anticipate. And timing and location are just as important as the probability of formation, especially when you have areas that can be impacted that are right in the middle of the main genesis region of the basin. And for us, for example, Guam is right in an area where you can have TCs forming immediately upstream or near to the Marianas Islands, that getting the timing and the location of that genesis correct, and then the subsequent intensification, it's a high degree of sensitivity to the potential impact to areas like that. So it's very important to get that right. And obviously, modeling and other tools have been rather imperfect in recent years at capturing some of the major events. And we're also thinking about, forecast communication. Again, different customer set in many respects than NHC, although our products do have impacts to the National Weather Service and civilian audiences as well. But similar to NHC, many customers end up focusing on the storm center and deterministic numbers, such as the distance that the eye is going to pass from my particular location, instead of the swath of impacts and probabilistic tools that can give you risk assessments. And so that's something that we're considering, as we continue to refine our product set and generate other decision support products for our customers. So again, this talk is going to focus mostly on rapid intensification. And I just want to mention some of the things that we're doing in recent years to try to help address this problem and increase our skill. And one of them is incorporating new tools from our research and development partners, such as the Naval Research Laboratory and CIRA, and other universities like University of Wisconsin that continue to help develop tools that have proven useful for RI. And this is a set of new aids that we've produced or begun producing in-house with the ATCF software. that have been transitioned for evaluation operations on our end. So we're in the process of kind of starting to incorporate these and evaluate their behavior and their skill in a real-time environment after seeing them proven in the research realm. One of them is REPA, similar to SHIP's RII, giving probabilistic estimates for different RI thresholds based on environmental parameters. We have a random forest-based aid similar to that called FRIA. We have RIDE, which is similar to NHC's DTOPS, generating a probabilistic forecast based on dynamical model guidance. We have aids from the CHIPS ensemble, CHR4, and we have another RI aid from the COAMPS TC ensemble. And I'm going to spend some more time on COAMPS TC in this talk as well. You can see on the right the various Pierce scores for different RI thresholds. The x-axis, I recognize may be a little hard to read, but those are different RI thresholds like 30 knots in 24 hours, et cetera. And for each of those, you have a colored line showing the skill. And REPA does a really good job. It's in green near the top at most of those thresholds. One of our best aids statistically. And one interesting point here is that relative to dynamical guidance, we see better skill even than HWRF and COAMPS deterministic run during small lead times. So before 48 hours, the statistical guidance does very well. And then after you get beyond 36, 48 hours, dynamical guidance like HWRF starts to catch up as the statistical aids become less skillful because current information becomes less valuable at that point. So one of the other interesting things that NRL has done for us is developed a way of forming a new intensity consensus that incorporates information about RI potential. So using that list of aids that I just talked about, they form a graceful consensus that has replacement of the main aids. So we have a regular intensity consensus like NHC does. And then we'll take each one of those aids and replace them with one of the RI equivalents, if you will, if RI is likely in that particular aid. So here on the right is a graph of the experimental consensus, icon E, versus the control, which is our regular icon consensus, icon C, in this particular plot. And the top lines there, very close together in solid color, are the mean error and or the mean absolute error, excuse me, and they're very close together. So the experimental consensus doesn't really change the overall error characteristic, but the dashed lines show the bias. And especially at short lead times, there's a much reduced negative bias in the orange dashed line there. So when you incorporate RI aids into the consensus, you actually reduce the negative bias that a regular intensity consensus typically has. During RI cases, a consensus is typically bad by its nature, taking a mean at actually capturing extreme rates of intensity change unless there's amazing agreement in the guidance. So what they've done is they've converted some of these probabilistic RI forecasts into deterministic ones based on the threshold that is most likely. So if REPA shows that, say, 45 knots in 36 hours is the most likely RI threshold, that gets translated into essentially a piecewise intensity function that just gives you a straight line 45 knots over the first 36 hours and makes that an aid that can then be incorporated and averaged with the other deterministic guidance. So another tool that we've been exposed to for the last few years is the COAMPS TC ensemble. And we've talked about this before and how useful this is, very unique in the tropical cyclone world, run by the Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center and developed by NRL. And they run experimental versions of this with updates usually annually or even more frequent. It's a 4-kilometer grid spacing ensemble, 21 members now across even the Pacific basins, which is really nice. You see an example there in the lower left for a Typhoon 12 whiskey from earlier this year with the intensity and coloring. And it's 1D ocean coupled, which is not amazing, but it provides really great guidance on upwelling cases and potential for TCs to weaken, which happens a lot in our basins. And we have many cases where that's relevant. So it's really nice having ocean aware guidance. And, you know, we have to bogus the TC structure out there. We don't have TDR. That would be quite nice. But we do have to submit TC vitals to to synthetically initialize characteristics of the vortex and things like COAMPS TC. One of the interesting things the ensemble does is it actually perturbs the TC structure. So each member can actually perturb things like the RMW, which I find fascinating for doing RI prediction well, because the RMW matters so much and the storm structural evolution matters so much. You could have a perfect environment, but RI won't happen if the storm structure is broad or something like that. So having those perturbations are nice. It would be nice if we had real data to do those perturbations with, but we usually don't, is just the reality of things. So I want to share a couple of RI success stories that we've had this year. We've had several RI events. We always have many, but a couple of them we've been capturing really well. This is plots from our operational ATCF software, same software that NHC uses to produce their forecasts. And the best track for these two typhoons, Malakas and Muifa, are shown in the black line with TC symbols. The official JTWC forecast is in red, and then all the other colored lines are various RI aids, including HWRF, which is in bright green there. And you'll see that for these two cases, we have pretty good forecasts for pretty significant rates of intensification, 55 knots in 42 hours and 60 knots in 42 hours. Pretty decent job during these cases, and starting below typhoon intensity too. So these were young systems that the modeling caught on quickly and did a pretty good job. And one thing to note here is that some of our statistical aids can actually overshoot HWRF correctly, which is fascinating considering HWRF is usually our most aggressive intensity model in at least the Western Pacific Basin. And so to have statistical aids be more aggressive and then be right is fascinating and nice to see in some of these cases. Now, not all cases are that easy. Some of our more extreme RI rates are still very, very challenging to capture, and that shouldn't be any surprise, of course. NHC also struggles to capture extreme rates of intensification, given that the guidance in general just can't make that happen. It's very hard to get the timing right, even if you do forecast an extreme rate of intensification. So here's two more examples, Super Typhoon Hinamnor and Super Typhoon Noru. And both of these went wild. If you didn't know, the Westpac can just get stupid crazy. So Noru was 90 knots in 24 hours, just completely insane. Started from a tropical storm and was 145 knots just a day later. And it actually had a double RI event during its evolution here on the right. You can see it go down as it crossed the Philippines. And then we had a second RI period back to super typhoon intensity in the South China Sea after it crossed the Philippines. And so it remains very difficult to anticipate these. You'll notice that for Hinamnor on the left, we actually got the peak intensity pretty well in the guidance envelope, but the timing was way too late. So the intensification really ramped up about a day in advance of where the forecasts were going. And that was really the challenge there. And one of the common denominators in some of these more extreme cases that are really hard to capture is very compact inner core structure. Immediately following genesis, very small radius of maximum wind. These are two microwave passes from these two typhoons right as RI was beginning. And again, these were, at the time of RI, these were sub-typhoon intensity, below 65 knots. And then these pictures are during the RI event, and these are all 10 to 15 kilometer or less radii of maximum wind. Very, very compact eye walls that formed. We had Super Typhoon Chanthu last year as well. I presented on that storm at AMS, and that also was an example of a storm that, even when it was a 30-knot vortex, had a 11-kilometer RMW, and it just went to town. Also like a 90 knot and 24-hour kind of intensification rate for that storm. So we get these crazy rates when they're compact vortices form in favorable environments. And whether it be a combination of, statistical models don't know about this. They don't have enough information about the structure. Dynamical models may not even resolve it well. They might not know it's there. Some of the existing data, even scatterometer data, may not be high enough resolution to give the model a clue in that the core is this tight. Things like that seem to cause big problems for us. So some more about COAMPS TC Ensemble. It's uniquely useful in situations where RI is going to happen for us. And the way we've been using it has really been helping us out. This is Typhoon Hinamnor again, 75 knots in 30 hours. And this is the one that the forecast was late and the RI occurred earlier than expected. Now on the right, what we get code given to us by NRL for making this plot in real time operationally is a bar plot showing the probability of different intensification rates from all the members of the ensemble. So in this case, pink indicates the fraction of members expecting RI versus other rates of intensification. So a tall bar all the way to the top would mean that every member expects RI. Now, in the case of Hinamnor, you can see that the peak there of the tall bars was at about a lead time of 24 to 48 hours. And that wasn't far off from the rest of the guidance. But what was really nice is that this curve kind of showed that there was also a risk for the RI to occur sooner. And the COAMPS TC ensemble was initialized at the beginning of these intensity traces. You can see there at the beginning, and right before the RI event, it was showing, hey, there's a chance that RI could actually begin immediately instead of being delayed a day. So relative to the other guidance, it provided a risk assessment that we could use to potentially, in hindsight, have bias corrected if we saw some structural indicators in data, the RI timing a little bit earlier based on that risk. For the other typhoon that I showed on the prior slides, Typhoon Noru, this was the double RI event. And again, the COAMPS TC ensemble was very useful here, showing the probability peaks for both RI events in advance. And you can see that on the ATCF intensity trace plot there, the time series, COAMPS TC was initialized even a cycle before the left-hand edge of this plot. So it was before the first RI event had even begun, and it got the timing and the likelihood of two RI events pretty accurately in this case. And watching these probability peaks kind of march in time toward shorter lead times has been a consistent behavior of this ensemble, which has been really encouraging for us to see. The fact that it's a 4-kilometer ensemble and providing guidance this useful has been fantastic and allows us to capture the risk of RI events more accurately than without it. So I just wanted to kind of finish by talking about some of our R&D priorities here at JTWC. Some of you may have seen this list before. We present it at a lot of talks. This is our top 5 priorities going forward for improving the aspects of our forecast that we want to improve the most. Of course, TC intensity change and RI are still kind of at the top of this list, given the impact that part of the forecast has. One thing that we've changed this year versus the prior 5 years is we've moved TC Genesis up to number 2. It was actually at number 5 prior to this year. We're moving it up because of the tremendous impact that has for our customers, and getting the timing, location, and probability of Genesis correct matters a lot for places, like I said, like Guam, but really anywhere. You can have a TC forming just upstream of many areas that can be impacted. And that's when awareness is low. You know, we have this problem here in the CONUS as well, where awareness is much lower when a TC is forming close to the coast versus approaching after several days of having warnings out. So they're really high impact events that we want to get right. And model guidance struggles until you have a TC structure that's coherent. So you have some of the highest model errors pre-Genesis as well. So this is an area that we really want to focus on. Our 2-week outlook for Genesis, which we produce on our decision support page for DoD customers, it is a little bit more challenging perhaps in some ways than NHC's Genesis forecast, because we don't use cumulative time windows, and we actually specify here's a couple day window where Genesis will probably happen. So we're trying to narrow down really the timing, not just like within like from 0 to 5 days. We're trying to target the timing a little bit more, and that can be challenging. So we're trying to get some more objective tools. Hopefully the R&D community can continue helping. We have a couple of projects that are ongoing at CIRA and elsewhere that could help with objective predictions of TC timing or TC Genesis timing and probability. And we hope to see more because we really are in need of objective tooling for that. We also have priorities, of course, for data exploitation, using microwave satellite imagery to derive unique structural characteristics or otherwise that could help statistical models, et cetera, to initialize the storm vortex better and actually forecast intensification. Things like what the University of Wisconsin are doing in terms of machine learning, trying to back out as much information as possible from the data that we do have, because we're limited out in the basins that we cover. We don't have aircraft reconnaissance. So we have to rely on the other satellite data sources that are there, and perhaps other in situ observations when the opportunity presents itself, buoys, et cetera. And this goes into specifying TC structure, which is obviously very important, is very data dependent, very important for modeling, and RI, it ties into everything. And it also ties into our communication of our forecast impacts. DoD relies a lot on the wind swath probability of 34 knot or greater wind. It's a feature. That's how our cone is defined per se. And getting the asymmetric structure of that cone correct is something that still needs to maybe someday be looked at. We have a symmetric cone right now based on the forecast radii, and someday being able to capture the asymmetric uncertainty in those impact areas would be helpful. And we're incorporating, the cooperation has been amazing with places like the National Hurricane Center getting wind probability code working to generate the probability swaths of 34, 50, and 64 knot winds. That's something that's available on our decision support page. And being able to specify wind radii with greater confidence is something that we're very interested going forward. And then TC track improvement, it's not that it's not important, but it's at the bottom of this list just because we are making improvements there faster than anywhere else. And I think NHC would say the same, that, that's what we have that we're doing very well with relative to things like intensity and structure and asymmetry and communication and socioeconomic behaviors based on the products and things like that. Track is going to keep improving, and it's been nice to see the progress that we've made. And I'm not doing a verification talk today, but similar to NHC, our long-term trends in track error are coming down and quickly over the last 10 years, which is really encouraging to see. So that's about all I have to share with you guys. I know we're a little over anyway, so if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
That idea of taking the rapid intensification index information and then folding it into the consensus is really different than the way NHC uses those. I think NHC just takes the consensus, the forecasters have the RI probabilities, and they can subjectively bump it up rather than putting it in, deterministically. Do you know if the forecasters have a preference on which way that they should go, or also do they know that that happened in the consensus? Like, do they know that this one happens to have, is already bumped up from the RI probabilities?
Yeah, so right now, the default set of aids in ATCF, we have modified to show both the normal consensus and then the RI based one when RI is possible. And we're still in the early innings of kind of evaluating how the aid performs. We know statistically it has lower bias, but we're just starting to use it and observe its behavior and have the forecasters give feedback on that going into next season as well. We'll probably get some more thoughts from them on how they think that behaves.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea to show both. That makes sense.
In West Pacific, the double stone, triple stone is pretty often. And how much you consider this stone-stone interaction, and how that useful for model have multiple nests in there to impact your consideration of the rapid intensification and the track forecast.
Yeah, we certainly do have a lot of multi-storm interactions. And I was really compelled, when I was working at HRD, it was when Gus Alaka was working on the basin scale HWRF with others and demonstrating the tremendous gain in skill you have when you have the nest to nest interaction. And I do think that's very compelling. I'm really hopeful that with HAFS, hopefully reaching initial operational capability next year, that if it's running across all the global basins, I'm really hoping to start evaluating that guidance to see if it helps, because we certainly have very strong errors related to that in some cases, especially when they get real close and start pinwheeling, it becomes a nightmare.
So I think we have a few minutes if there's any sort of other Q&A or anybody wants to go back to any of the other speakers for any final discussion. We got a couple minutes before lunch. I'll just open it up if anybody has anything. Everybody's hungry. Nope. Go, Paul.
I want to bring up the concept of ensemble prediction and how that's going to be useful, because as we progress with 2 versions of HAFS probably, and then do we see, because we want to tie to the session which we have put together on Wednesday too. So do you find, do you think forecasters will find a use for more ensemble members as we go down? Because we are starting to use single member, only one model, which is a HAFS, when compared to what you are looking at multi-models. Some kind from you may be welcome.
Yeah, I think we strongly interested in multi-model ensemble, but also, I mean, I think we're, Levi showed what they're able to do with the COAMPS TC ensemble in the West Pacific. And I think that's a gap that we have in our basins that we would very much be interested in exploiting going forward. BJ, did you? Oh, was there? Oh, Pete, go ahead, Pete.
Okay, thanks. Levi, I just had a quick question for you. Wondered if you utilize the synthetic aperture radar observations that Noah Nesdis archives for evaluation of the post-storm evaluation of RI.
Hi, Pete. I'm sorry, which Nesdis product again?
That's the synthetic aperture radar evaluation of wind profiles in tropical cyclones worldwide.
Yes, we love SAR data. We wish there was more of it. The only big downside to it is the huge gaps and unavailability for weaker storms, because typically the satellites can only be tasked to do a pass for stronger storms and only a certain lead time in advance. So if you get the forecast position wrong, it's going to miss. But as the geophysical model functions keep getting refined for the instrument, the quality is improving, and it seems like a very compelling data source, especially if someday we're able to get a vector direction as well as magnitude from SAR, which is theoretically possible, but is not yet being done. If it can be done in the future, that's going to be game-changing to supplement scatterometers to get high resolution detail of the storm structure and also at higher intensities. So we are big fans of SAR.
Yeah, I think the potential for the future is that especially if more of these radar satellites become available and the latency gets reduced. Almost like having your own aircraft recon from those places.
Hey, Pete, we're not able to hear you. It's broken up pretty badly there. Go ahead, Gus.
Yeah, to Levi's point earlier about basin scale HWRF, we are.
Yeah, is this a little better?
Yeah, we got Gus talking now, though. Pete, we'll come back to you. Hold on a second. Go ahead, Gus.
Yeah, to the comment about basin scale HWRF and thinking about multi-storm, we are prioritizing those developments in HAFS right now. Bill Ramstrom's leading those developments, and we're really excited to put together a research version of HAFS that's very much like the basin scale HWRF. You could call it the multi-storm version or whatever. So we're looking forward to hopefully getting a demo of that next summer, if not at least having all the infrastructure in place to start running some tests. So I'll definitely keep you and others in the loop. I'll be presenting a bit on that tomorrow as well.
Thanks, Gus. Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, sorry for the bad comms here. My headset got unplugged from my laptop, but I just wanted to comment. It's almost like having your own aircraft reconnaissance with the quality of data that's becoming available through these synthetic aperture radar devices, especially detecting these really tiny storms that you talked about, Levi. With radius of maximum wind values of 5 or 6 nautical miles, and it's I know it's a problem with the latency of the observations right now, but that may have a potential for the future there for work, validation work on rapid intensification.
Thanks, Pete. VJ?
This question is for Levi. So there are still discrepancies in the way intensity is reported by different RSMCs within Western Pacific region or Indian Ocean region. And that potentially can have an impact on how we are verifying our models or trying to evaluate the improvements that we are trying to document. So is there any concerted effort in unifying or kind of pushing towards a standard metrics everywhere, or?
Well, I think I would personally agree that it would be nice to have a standardized way to do it. And a point maximum 10 meter sustained wind is a very difficult metric to evaluate in the first place because of how noisy it is. And as our models grow in resolution, it's even worse. I think Gus co-authored some work on, how even some simple smoothing in model forecasts of Vmax can really change the characteristics of the error. So I think we have a strong interest in figuring out if we're going to run ourselves into error saturation just because of the metric that that most people are using. But to your point, around the world, there are different wind averaging thresholds and ways of estimating it. And, maybe WMO can help nudge everyone towards standardizing that somehow, but it's an international kind of effort. And I have no idea how that would happen per se. But I will just say that personally, I find it interesting that some research that's been done on estimating Vmax with things like wave number 0 and 1 components only of the circulation, maybe some sort of intuitive way of removing the noise from especially high resolution NWP output might be an advantageous way to target the predictable part of the TC structure that actually matters outside of the tiny convective maxima that pollute a lot of the forecasts.
Yeah, I think in the absence of recon data, it's even going to be even more difficult. I have a different question for both of you, for NHC and JTWC. Gopal brought up the question of ensembles. You've been evaluating the ensembles from the global models in terms of the spread. Sometimes, as we find, the best track falls outside the cone or outside the envelope of the ensembles. So, there is a eagerness from the modeling community to increase the number of ensemble members, to increase the spread. Obviously, the computational aspects are going to preclude us to do high resolution ensembles like what you would probably want to see, but even at a quarter degree or 13 kilometer, 15 kilometer resolution that an ECMWF provides. What is the meaningful spread you would like to see? Is that just like if you run the model 200 times, you will probably capture much larger uncertainty or much larger spread. But there should be some threshold of the spread error relationship that we need to maintain. And so that's kind of a resource question as well as the application, the practical application of ensembles, not just for the spread, but also the probabilistic products that you would like to generate. So any comments on that from the global perspective?
Yeah, I guess thinking, I don't know if we've thought about it that way from the human forecaster perspective. I think obviously we'd want to have the solution fall within the spread most of the time, or have an ensemble design such that it was somewhat reliable and that there was a reliable spread skill relationship. Because right now I think we're not quite there yet. I think the spread, say, of the GFS has gotten better with more members. I think it's generally more dispersive. It's not as but I think all the global ensemble systems still tend to be a little under dispersive. They all tend to cluster. I think it's even more important from sort of the probabilistic product perspective. If we're going to try to come up with dynamical situational uncertainty information for showing even potentially like, what does the next cone look like? Do we want to devise a cone that captures the track of the storm 90% of the time? So if you're really outside the cone, the impacts potential is going to be a lot smaller than it is now. Or you go back to like Andy's talk, or thinking about the wind speed probabilities, and how do you reliably show that uncertainty such that those products become better calibrated and really are more situationally useful to the user community. I think that's sort of what we'd want to aim for. Levi, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's tough because for example, the COAMPS TC ensemble actually has very high spread. And in fact, it was so high that the most recent update to the model deliberately tried to reduce it, because even though it was containing a lot of most of the solutions, and the spread skill relationship was actually okay. The spread was so wide that, we would often look at it and wonder, well, why is it so wide? It's almost too wide to be confident in some circumstances. So it is an interesting problem. But I know we have trouble with even some overspread in, say, the European ensemble track, for example, is I think a little over dispersive in some cases, and that can lead to problems as well.
Yeah, the other thing I think about is in terms of, you want your ensemble to be helpful in identifying areas to target observations or where the uncertainty is. We're starting to take baby steps into that, not baby steps, we're using that now in terms of drawing synoptic surveillance flights, but you could see that being expanded to other parameters and sort of broadening that out to other observation types as well. Go, Paul.
This is a challenge for modelers too. Thanks for bringing this question. Actually, what we have found from Gus's study, as well as we have run, you run 100 times, Ian, we might get 2 members going the right direction. That's what we are starting to find with models. Both the cases with Gus ran, as well as Andy has been working on terrain or walking, for instance. I think some of them are coming from predictability issue and the need for us to improve ensemble, the way we do ensemble itself in models. Vijay, that's one of the problems that we see.
So I want to put Curtis on the spot. How are you looking at this problem for your higher resolution models? To me, it strikes me that the severe storms and even winter weather, the time scales, the actual time frames are different, but you have similar problems. And it's, it would be interesting if we could interact together on this problem to see how you're addressing it. I know from our work with the HWT folks that they've been taking our ideas about cone and time, wind speed probability and stuff to apply it there. But it seems like this is an area of possible fruitful collaboration.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I guess would start with the challenge that we do see on the convective allowing scale. Our ensemble systems, and we're going to talk about that for a little bit in terms of spread, are all generally under dispersive at that scale. So we don't capture the rare events as often as we need to in the solution space. So there's a fundamental push to still work on improving the spread skill relationship of the ensemble system. And that's happening through a variety of ways, whether it's stochastic physics, improving the initial condition perturbations or whatnot. So that's one fundamental challenge. You can post-process the ensemble guidance to try to do better with the probabilistic information that comes out of that. But it doesn't get to the underlying systemic problem of the ensemble just being fundamentally under dispersive. So we need to continue to work on that. From a user perspective, one of the challenges we have is we have a lot of stakeholders that look at the CAM guidance, the ensemble guidance. They don't want probabilities. They just don't know how to use that information. The stakeholders, users don't, they want some sort of yes, no information. They want something that's deterministic. And while that's obviously somewhat ill-posed in its sort of challenge, we still think we can be smarter about how we synthesize something from the ensemble that can look deterministic, but is actually not. And so trying to find a way to come up with sort of the most likely and the maybe best and worst case scenario information from the ensemble that has the details in it that look like a deterministic forecast, but it's really underpinned by the PDF, is something that we're starting to look at, and something we should absolutely coordinate on, because the problems are similar, so similar. So those are certainly some things that I'm seeing us wrangling with in the severe weather convection allowing groups. So I guess I'd leave it at that to start with. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one last, yeah, we're past one, so I gotta give people a break here. Go ahead, Bill.
I had sort of two questions about the 7-day range. Number one was, if you think about, looking at the ensemble, sometimes you'll see the spread is enormous because of what's going on. So I wonder if maybe you have a threshold that says, we only issue a forecast if our spread is within 750 miles or something like that. And so some days you get 7 days, some days you just won't get it. And then from the modeling perspective of, as we look at this regional moving nest, I would be concerned about a 7-day regional moving nest. Maybe I think we would start to talk about, maybe we need to have the nest being in a global. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for that longer range, the second part, I think that's probably right. We need, things embedded in, whatever the next generation global system is going to work towards. First question reminded me of the never make a forecast you never have to make. It could be never make a forecast you never want to make. But that would be very difficult from a user communication perspective if you were turning a forecast on and off, and people really want to know consistently what's going to be available to them. I mean, it makes sense from a scientific perspective, maybe, that you would only do it if you thought you could, but practically that would be very, very challenging. Yeah, Jason.
Just a quick comment, quote, response to that. Like, what about not having a point, but having like a circle?
Correct. That's what I mentioned that earlier. Yeah, maybe you just wouldn't put a point somewhere. I mean, you're going to have a point to draw the circle around.
Sure, right.
And people are going to find the point and do things with it that maybe you wouldn't want them to do.
Sure.
Because it's going to be in a database.
Well, that's a
somewhere.
problem for being dumb.
Right. But that's, but yeah, I mean, I think, a 6 or 7 day area rather than something that looks deterministic is probably the way to initially go. So one last word from Stan.
I'll just agree with turning it off and turning it on just doesn't work. When we started the NOAA seasonal outlook, our commitment was we'll only do it for the years that the signal is really clear. It's like, oh, fat chance. Once you give it to them, they're never, it drives them. Public is finicky with that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for a great session, everybody. Just give an extra round of applause to all the speakers. Go, Paul. Yep. Yep, glad to be here. And so I guess we've got a break for lunch until about 2:30. So enjoy.